Hello and welcome to Ubi Petrus. We've got a real treat for you today. I think it's like the afternoon in America, but over here it's pretty much the evening. We've got two debaters to debate the topic of is the papacy biblical? And my my recommendation to everyone, we're going to ask you to be very, very civil in the chat. I don't want any rudeness. I want any of our mods, if people are being abrasive or unpleasant to any persons, to just time those people out so they can learn their lesson and then come back in civility. Because Suan has been very, very gracious doing an interview with Ubi for the last 1.5 hours. He's a very nice person. There's no need to just be difficult, right? And he's a very intelligent person. So the structure is going to be basically both will present 20 minutes. Both will do a 20-minute presentation. So Suan's going to do a 20-minute presentation in affirmative position, and then Ubi will do a 20-minute presentation, and then it'll just be free-flowing discussion, followed by 5-minute closing statements and some Q&A at the end. So Suan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Lewis, thank you for having me on, and Ubi, thank you for just being very kind and sharing your knowledge with me. Let me begin by saying that I'm a philosophy student at Kansas State University. I'm in my 3rd year finishing up, and then I'll have 1 year left, and then from there, we'll see where God takes me. But I'm a recent convert to the Catholic faith, so I was originally Protestant. I became Catholic last May. And I kind of found it funny because I was looking at the chat a little bit earlier, and someone asked, "How'd you get Kim Jong-un on?" And I remember when I was in high school at a constitutional studies seminar in Washington D.C., some of my friends said, "Hey, you know, he kind of looks like Kim Jong-un," and I thought it was funny. So when I saw that comment, I know it was kind of to jest or kind of mock, but I thought it was kind of funny. So I don't take myself too seriously. I enjoy these types of conversations. And I only do them not because I'm trying to get clout, but because I really do care about the kingdom of God and really what our Savior did 2,000 years ago. And what is the church? I think that's such an important question. And I'm happy to have Ubi here to discuss that with me.
All right, and Ubi, would you like to give a brief introduction of yourself? I mean, this is your channel, or our channel, I guess, but yeah.
Yes, my name is Ubi, and I work with Lewis, and there's not a whole lot to be said about me. I'm no one of any particular importance, although I am tremendously honored to have Suan on today. Suan is a very formidable interlocutor. Has done some very, very great work. It's a great pleasure to have him on. I'm a convert from Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy. I converted when I was in my late teens or around the age of 20, and I've been an Orthodox Christian for about 20 years now.
All right, excellent. So I suppose we'll just get straight into it. And Suan, whenever you're ready, as soon as you start talking, you have 20 minutes. I want everyone to listen intently, pay attention, consider the arguments seriously, so whenever you're ready.
All right. I'm going to argue that Christ established a successional Petrine ministry that is supreme and infallible. Now, for this conversation today, I want to set forward 2 standards, because we're not going to go into the biblical text, so to speak, objectively or neutrally. We're going to have various tools for interpreting the scriptures. So one is that I want to make a distinction between an interpretation that's valid versus compelling. So when I say an interpretation is valid, it's more like saying, well, I can see how you came to that interpretation, even though I don't feel personally obliged to accept it. So kind of seeing, well, I can see why you would find that compelling. Whereas a compelling interpretation is based on some shared fact or belief, and we're saying that from this shared fact or belief, the interpretation follows. So I want to keep that distinction in mind. The second standard I want to set forward is originalism. So which interpretation respects the original context of the scriptures? For instance, the authorial intent, the surrounding first century culture, the Jewish theology and background traditions and the earliest interpretations that we have. So this would include the church fathers and other various texts. So those are the two standards that I want to set forward. Now, my argument begins first by acknowledging that Peter is the new Eliakim. We read in Matthew 16:19, Jesus says, quote, "I will give you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." We see in Isaiah 22:22, "Then I will put the key of the house of David on his shoulder. When he opens, no one will shut. When he shuts, no one will open." Let me first justify that we have a typological parallel here. First, there's a common structure between both passages. God gives the keys of a kingdom to a person whose decisions are secured by God's promise. Second, there's a similar religious context, corruption to purity. In Isaiah 22:15-16, the background context for verse 22, we see that Shebna, the original prime minister, was a corrupt leader who defied God by picking a tomb where the Lord did not approve, and therefore he is stripped of his authority, and God puts Eliakim in his place. Anthony J. Soderini, in the Erdman's Commentary on the Bible, notes that in Caesarea Philippi, when Christ makes this declaration, there was a rock of pagan worship set up by Philip the Tetrarch to honor both Caesar Augustus and the deity Pan. So we see then that Jesus here is saying that he is creating a new temple, so to speak, or he's declaring Peter his rock of his church. And he's doing all of this in the sight of a place that is corrupt, and that Jesus is saying we're moving from paganism now to Christianity. And likewise, in the Old Testament, we see a transition from corruption into purity and newness. Even Ben Witherington III, in his commentary on Matthew, notes that the surrounding geography of the Caesarea Philippi shows to us that, for instance, when Christ mentions that the gates of hell or the netherworld will not prevail against his church, around the rock of Caesarea Philippi, there was a stream that led down to what the pagans believed was the netherworld. So there's this theme here of going from corruption to purity in both passages. Likewise, there's a similar political context in both passages. In the NRSV HarperCollins Study Bible, both Eliakim and Peter received their keys before the fall of Jerusalem. Quote, "Shebna's office is promised to Eliakim, who apparently replaced Shebna before the siege of Jerusalem." Isaiah 36:3, 2 Kings 18:18. And likewise, we know that in the New Testament, the temple is destroyed in AD 70, and Peter receives the keys sometime before AD 33. Fourth, Jesus is the new David. God promises David in 2 Samuel 7, 8-14, that one of David's sons will establish David's throne and kingdom forever, and that this son will also be God's son. We read in Luke 1:32-33, quote, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." Likewise, we see, for instance, in the Oxford Commentary, People of the Covenant, the 4th edition, that in Jewish messianic expectations and theology, the belief was that, centrally speaking, the Messiah would be a king, and specifically a king from the Davidic line who would rebuild the Davidic monarchy. Fifth and finally, then, we see that there's widespread scholarly recognition that the two passages are typological parallels. For instance, the prominent Protestant scholar Craig L. Blomberg, in a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old, writes, quote, "The keys to the kingdom, 1619, is almost certainly based on the identical metaphor in Isaiah 22:22, the New Bible Commentary. The phrase 1619 is almost certainly based on Isaiah 22:22, where Shebna the steward is displaced by Eliakim and his authority is transferred to him." Or even Patrick Gray, in the Rutledge Guidebook to the New Testament. Many scholars discern an allusion to the ancient Israelite practice of the king granting authority to a prime minister who, as holder of the key of the house of David, is deputized to make binding decisions on his behalf, on behalf of the king. Now let me make the argument that Peter and Eliakim are types of each other. So first, both Peter and Eliakim are compared to objects. Eliakim is compared to a peg that will one day collapse, presumably during the fall of Jerusalem, Isaiah 22:23-35. Peter, however, is identified as the rock of Christ's church, Matthew 16:18. Likewise, both Peter and Eliakim appear first on the list of their king's disciples. In his book, Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions, archaeologist Roland DeVoe writes, quote, "All the affairs of the land passed through his hands. All important documents received his seal. All officials were under his orders. Like the Egyptian vizier, the master of the palace or the prime minister, was the highest official in the state. His name, Eliakim, comes first in the list of 2 Kings 18:18. He alone appears with the king in 1 Kings 18:3. And Jotham bears this title, one of the other prime ministers, when he acts as a regent of the kingdom, 2 Kings 15:5, as the vizier did in the absence of Pharaoh. This is to say that the prime minister could function as the king of Israel when the king had currently left the palace or was not immediately there to rule. Likewise, Peter's name also appears first in the list of the king's disciples. Mark 3:16-19, Matthew 10:2-4, Luke 6:14-16, Acts 1:13. Matthew 10:2 even calls Peter first, or protos, which is meant, quote, not just first on the list, but a privileged status. Judas, the most dishonored, is last. That is from Dale Allison in the Oxford Bible Commentary. With this typology established now, there's the question of how do we get to papal supremacy, succession, and infallibility? Well, first, the keys imply succession, singular succession. Before Eliakim, there was Shebna. Before Shebna, there was Azra, 1 Kings 16:9, Jotham 15:5, and Ahishar 4:6. How about supremacy? The keys make one second in command to David's son. First, the keys have two functions. They open and shut the gates of the royal palace, and they symbolize the prime minister's authority. The NIV Cultural Background Bible, quote, in the biblical period, locks were quite large and required a correspondingly large and heavy bronze or iron key. When Eliakim is given its key, its size and probably its elaborate decoration would serve as a visible symbol of its authority to lock and unlock the rooms and gates of the palace in Jerusalem. On page 87 of Craig S. Keener's 2014 IVP New Testament commentary, quote, the keeper of the keys was one of the most important roles of a household servant. Because keys were bulky and might be carried by only a single person, they also symbolized authority. A high official held the keys in a royal kingdom and in God's house, the temple. Once again, Saldarini, in the Erdman's commentary on the Bible, writes, quote, the image of keys connotes ruling authority. See Isaiah 22:22 on keys as the power of the king's prime minister, or Revelation 1:18, as does the metaphor of binding and loosing, 16:19. Second, the prime minister's authority is second to the king's. On page 603 of the New Bible Commentary, quote, the shutting and opening mean the power to make decisions which no one under the king could override. On page 158 of the Erdman's Bible Dictionary, quote, in conferring upon Peter authority as head of the church, Matthew 16:19, Jesus uses the rabbinical terms to bind and to loose. In rabbinic usage, the terms mean to forbid and to permit with reference to interpretation of the law, and secondarily to condemn or place under the ban and to acquit. Thus, Peter is given the authority to determine the rules for doctrine and life by virtue of subsequent revelation and the leading of the Spirit, John 16:13, and to demand the obedience of the church, reflecting the authority of the royal chamberlain or vizier in the Old Testament, see Isaiah 22:22. I can also reiterate, for example, what Roland DeVoe said about how the prime minister was the highest official in the Davidic kingdom, how he was basically the king's vicar and could rule in his place when the king was not immediately present to rule. Or even we can talk about the 2017 Rutledge Guidebook to the New Testament, where the prime minister is deputized to make decisions in the name of or on behalf of the king, and hence could properly be understood as his vizier. Now, I think that Acts 15 provides us an interesting case in which we see King David become a type for Peter, as there are other examples throughout the New Testament of, for instance, Peter inheriting the types of Christ. So, for instance, Christ is compared to the new Moses. Here, I'm focusing on Christ being compared to the new David. So first, the council in Acts 15, they're both typological parallels. There's a council of Jerusalem in the Old Testament and a council of Jerusalem in the New Testament. Both concern the construction and definition, of the temple or church, and the most important leaders are present at both councils. Acts 15:4, 1 Chronicles 28:1. Peter and David both rise before the assembly to address it. Acts 15:7, 1 Chronicles 28:2. Both claim before everyone that they were chosen from the rest for a specific mission. Acts 15:7, 1 Chronicles 28:4. Both gatherings are called ecclesia, the word in the New Testament used for church in Greek. 1 Chronicles 28:2, Acts 15:22. And likewise, we see examples here of Petrine primacy. For instance, Peter prepares the way for the other apostles to speak. Before Peter speaks, we read in the text that there was a bunch of conversation between the elders and the leaders of the church, Acts 15:6 and Acts 15:12. Peter also speaks on behalf of the church when he declares that we are saved by by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, Acts 15:11. And even James, the bishop of Jerusalem, reiterates Peter's words in his ruling, Acts 15:13-21. The point I'm making here is that there seems to be a clear example in which if Peter has the keys, then he is the prime minister. The prime minister can represent the king. And in Acts 15, we see Peter inherit one of the types that is usually applied to Jesus, that is the person of David. In Acts 15, Peter represents the person of David, and hence we see the fulfillment of the keys being applied. Now, when it comes to papal infallibility, I think we can point out, for instance, as stated before, that binding and loosing stand for the legislative and judicial powers of the rabbis, the power to interpret scripture and discipline the community. Now, to say that heaven stands behind one's binding and loosing is in essence infallibility, and this is said to Peter. For instance, the Erdman's commentary on the Bible notes that Jesus is making a divine endorsement here. The New Interpreter's Bible commentary says that it's a divine ratification of when Peter binds and looses. Or even in R.T. France's New International Commentary on the New Testament, in his commentary on Matthew, he views it as a kind of divine guidance. So here we have then an example of Christ establishing a successional Petrine ministry that is supreme and infallible. Now, second, I want to argue that Peter is the new Joshua. In John 21:15-19, Peter is reinstated into service through a threefold commission from Christ. He is told to feed his babes, his lambs, and his sheep. So how do we know that Peter is portrayed as the new Joshua here? Well, there are four reasons why. First, Peter and Joshua are both the primary disciples of their master. The ancient rabbinic sources note that Joshua was the primary disciple of Moses compared to the others. The first century Jewish historian Josephus even uses the same Greek word for disciple, methetes, in describing Joshua that the New Testament uses to describe the disciples. To say that Joshua was a disciple of Moses, much like the apostles to Jesus, is not anachronistic. Moreover, Peter was clearly the primary disciple of Jesus. Second, Peter and Joshua received their flocks under similar contexts. For instance, Jesus calls Peter Simon, son of John in verse 15. Just as Deuteronomy 34:9 says, Moses filled Joshua, son of Nun, with the Spirit before handing over his flock, his Israel, to Joshua. Christ tells Peter in verse 18 that someone will, quote, put, wrap, gird a belt on you, as an allusion to his death, just as in Jewish tradition, Moses is described as being wrapped, girded, and veiled before his death and picking Joshua as his successor. Sifra Pinhas 139 on Numbers 27:17. Christ mentions that Peter's hand will be stretched out, presumably in a crucifixion similar to his, just as in Jewish tradition, Moses prayed to die with his hands outstretched, like Aaron. The strongest evidence, however, is that Peter and Joshua received the same three kinds of sheep. Roger David Oss, in his book on John 21:15-19, notes from the Avot of Rabbi Natan, which I have on my shelf, in 1 Enoch, Moses hands to Joshua in Jewish tradition, quote, the smaller ones, the bigger, older sheep, and the young, strong sheep. In John 21:15-17, Jesus begins with the little lambs and sucklings, proceeds to the young sheep, and ends with the older, fully mature sheep. Although Jesus presents the sheep with a progression of age, they are nonetheless the same kind that Moses hands to Joshua. And thus, this is why even the Lutheran scholar Roger David Oss concludes that Jesus here makes Peter the new head shepherd of Israel, just as Moses had made Joshua the head shepherd of Israel, vesting in him his authority. Now, we can also go into other examples, like, for instance, Jesus is clearly presented as the new Moses in Scripture, and this was part of what it meant to be the Messiah in Judaism itself. For instance, in Deuteronomy 18:15, Moses says that a prophet like him will come out, and everyone will have to listen to this prophet who is like him. Acts 3:22, Peter identifies Jesus as this new Moses. But furthermore, and I think most importantly, Jewish tradition around and after the time of Jesus taught that Moses handed his throne to Joshua. Oss writes, quote, "The Testament of Moses, Sifra Pinhas 140 on Numbers 27:19, and the Petret Moshe each attest that Joshua received Moses' throne. Oss therefore concludes, quote, Hellenistic and Palestinian Jewish Christians may have considered Peter then as sitting, quote, on the seat of Moses." So why does this matter? Well, I think it actually gets us papal supremacy. So first, we see that Jesus mentions the throne of Moses in the New Testament. In Matthew 23:2-3, Jesus says, quote, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach." Wolfgang Schrag, in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, quotes, "It is a symbol of authority vested in the teachers of the Torah in the synagogue. They sat on this as the successors of Moses." Likewise, Herbert Basser and Marcia Cohen, in their book, The Gospel of Matthew and Judaic Traditions, they note that in Exodus 18:26, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, tells him that he shouldn't judge all the cases alone, and that instead, Moses should institute a court in which the judges can settle the cases, and if they're too difficult, then the cases are brought to Moses for him to be the final singular authority. In Deuteronomy 17:8-11, likewise, we see Moses create this institutional arrangement for all time. Thus, Basser and Cohen conclude that the High Court in Jerusalem, which issued binding decrees ex cathedra in accord with biblical legislation, is what Jesus means here when he talks about the throne or the seat of Moses. And even Rabbi Samuel Tobias Laux, in his, quote, rabbinic commentary on the New Testament, also backs up that in Matthew 23:2-3, when Jesus says, "Obey everything they teach you," this comes straight out of Deuteronomy 17:10, when Moses instituted the High Court. In essence, then, Basser and Cohen are correct that Jesus is talking about here the High Court or the Great Sanhedrin. And even in his 2014 IVP commentary, Keener notes that many Jewish people during the time of Jesus believed that the Sanhedrin could institute the heavenly rulings coming from God himself. So where does Peter receive the throne of Moses? Well, we see in Acts chapter 5, verse 5 and verse 11, that when he rebukes Ananias and Sapphira, both Ananias and Sapphira fall dead. Now, in Deuteronomy 17:13, it says that if you dishonor God's priest, then you will be put to death. And then it says, all the people will hear and be afraid. Both times after Ananias and Sapphira die, it likewise says both times, all the people heard and were afraid. The second time it says the entire church heard and was afraid. So clearly here then what we're seeing is that Peter, if he's seated on the throne of Moses, then he can institute the powers of the throne of Moses, and Peter, in effect, like Joshua, would become a one-man supreme court on faith and morals with his binding and loosing power. So thus, I think we see here that we have a clear example of papal supremacy. When it comes to papal infallibility, throughout the Jewish tradition, it's noted that the High Court is infallible. Now, there's some debate on the extent of this infallibility, but we can get into that later. But even, for instance, Rabbi Shabbatai Bass in Siftei Shakamin is adamant that the court of Moses is infallible. And then finally, when it comes to papal succession, we know that the rabbis would lay their hands on others, and this is how they would pass on their authority. If Peter's a rabbi here, then I see no problem why he couldn't pass on his authority. And that's all the time I have.
Excellent. Thank you, Suan, for that detailed presentation. A reminder to everyone just to be, once again, I need to reiterate, to be civil, to pay attention to what is being said in the video, not to get bogged down in chat. Ubi, are you there?
Yes, I am. And Suan, if you'd like some more time, a few more minutes to finish your presentation, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I could take more time if you also get the same amount of extra time for your presentation. I want to be fair.
Yeah, that works perfectly. Take however much time you need to finish your presentation.
I think I maybe need only 5 more minutes. Is that okay with you,
All right.
Lewis?
Yeah, let's do that.
Take 5, take 10, Take whatever you need.
Yeah, I won't go as long as Paul preaching until the very next day. So don't worry. All right,
go
I'll
ahead.
just continue where I left off. Is that all right? All right, I'm timing
Go
myself
for
in
it.
3, 2, 1.
Go for it.
All right, so then I also wanted to mention why Rome matters in this entire conversation. So this is going on to my next point. So Roger David Oss notes on page 198 of his book on John 21:15 and 19 that the Jews believed that the Messiah would, quote, redeem his people from subjugation from the last of the four kingdoms, Rome. John Bright and George E. Ladd, in their respective studies of the kingdom of God in the New Testament, likewise note that the Jews believed that when the Messiah would come, he would conquer Rome. Thus, in other words, Rome is tightly associated with Jewish messianic prophecy. If Jesus is the Messiah, then he will especially conquer Rome and claim it for the kingdom of God. Not Antioch, not Alexandria, not Constantinople, but Rome according to the Jews. So thus, even though some people would like to say, well, Peter established the church in Antioch, he established churches elsewhere. The reason why Rome gets special attention is because it is intrinsically tied back to the Jewish messianic expectations on what Jesus would do when he would bring the kingdom of God. So in other words, then, we could say in effect that Jesus, as the son of David, as the new Moses, as the new Messiah, in conquering Rome, he also established his prime minister there, and hence that's where the new Israel is stationed. That's where the messianic prophecy is most concretely fulfilled. So in conclusion, let me return to the two standards I offered. First, I made a distinction between an interpretation that is valid versus compelling. I want to say that my arguments here are compelling because my case for the papacy does not rest on Peter alone, but fundamentally on the identity of Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus being the new David and the son of David, bringing in the Davidic kingdom and rebuilding it once again, and Jesus being the new Moses, hence making Joshua the shepherd of the new Israel. So for instance, when it comes to my argument that Peter is the new Eliakim, first, Jesus, as the new David, rebuilt his father's kingdom into the new Israel or the church. Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trifro, is quite explicit that the church is the new Israel and that us as Christians are the new Israelites. Moreover, to profess that Jesus is the Messiah is to just simply be within orthodoxy. And so I think that there's a strong basis for accepting that, well, if you accept that Jesus is the Messiah, then you have to believe that he rebuilt the Davidic monarchy. And I want to say third, that it is better to strengthen our apologetic with our Jewish brothers and sisters by acknowledging that Jesus rebuilt the Davidic monarchy, as evidenced by Peter being his prime minister, Jesus' prime minister. To reject this point is to unnecessarily weaken our apologetic to our Jewish brothers and sisters. But the more physical or literal one takes the reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy in the New Testament, so too must one take more physically and literally the corresponding office of prime minister in the new Israel. When it comes to Peter being the new Joshua, first, the Jewish context is important for understanding the doctrine of apostolic succession and the apostolic ministry itself. When I ran out of time, I wanted to mention the fact that when Irenaeus defends, for instance, bringing up the succession of the bishops, this is something that the ancient Israelites did themselves and during the time of Jesus. The Pharisees would do this process called semikah, which is the Hebrew word for ordination. And in order to be a validly ordained priest or judge, you had to be able to trace your ordination back to Joshua and through Moses. So the point that I'm making is that the arguments I'm offering and the traditions that make Peter the new Joshua, but also the new Moses, simultaneously strengthen the case for apostolic succession. So if you want all the evidence for apostolic succession from the Jewish traditions, then you also have to take in the Jewish traditions that make Peter the new Joshua, seated on the throne of Moses and the head shepherd of Israel. So then I want to say that one cannot therefore, on pain of undermining the apostolic ministry, cherry pick the Jewish traditions. If you accept the Jewish traditions defending apostolic succession, you have to accept the ones defending Peter as the new Joshua and as sitting on the throne of Moses. So the other case that I wanted to offer was originalism. So which interpretation respects the original context of the scriptures? Here, I've cited the Jewish sources extensively. And moreover, I think that my case takes the Jewish inheritance of Christianity most seriously and completely, rather than revising it in an ad hoc fashion. Thus, Jesus, the new Messiah, conquered Rome,
and placed his prime minister there. There resides in Rome the head shepherd of the new Israel. Christ established a successional Petrine ministry that is supreme and infallible. Whether or not the church understood this immediately is another question.
Wow. I must say the professionalism is simply impossible to floor. Yeah, so Ubi, are you ready to do your 25?
Yes, I am. Suan, that was a very good presentation. Thank you for giving that.
Thank you, Ubi.
So whenever you start your well, yeah, because I think didn't you tell me you wanted to do a PowerPoint or something?
Oh, yeah, let me get that up. I'm real boomer tech here, so I'm gonna need some help getting it set up. Okay, so I have it here, and Lewis, which buttons do I push?
So you so you press share,
Do I
and
hit
then
the
you
share
press
screen and then from there?
share screen, and then you click
Okay.
your entire screen, and then you click share,
Mhm.
and yeah, make sure you have your PowerPoint ready. And I'll see it, and
Is
I'll
it
put it in.
application window?
No, it should just be your whole
There
screen
we
because
go.
otherwise it will.
Do you see it now?
It's coming up. Let's take a look.
Do you see it now?
Yeah, start it up. Like start the actual slides.
Okay.
No, it's not doing it. I told you to share your entire screen, not just the application window. Boomer tech.
1 second. So it's there. Oh, very boomer tech here. So share screen,
Entire screen,
screen.
not just an application window.
and then your entire. Okay. Okay.
Yep. Start up your PowerPoint, and then let's take a look.
There we go. Okay.
See if it should come up. Hang on. Perfect. Okay. I want to see something. If I remove my.
Okay. We ready?
Okay, go when you're ready. Yeah.
We ready?
Yeah, as soon as you start, I'll start your time.
Okay, here I go. So Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16, is there a connection? All right. It is universally understood that there is scant patristic evidence for the comparison between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22. There's some claim that in St. John Cassian, St. Ephraim the Syrian, and Afrahat the Persian sage. The fact remains that none of the Greek fathers using the Septuagint reference the text. And this is probably because the most popular text of the Septuagint used by the Church Fathers simply does not mention the keys. You can see here, it says, and the key, which in Hebrew is Mefta'ach, of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, so he shall open and then shall shut, and he shall shut and then shall open. If you look at the Greek, it says, Ke dosoten doxan David avto, and I will give him the glory of David, and what he shuts and shall open. No mention of a key, and this begs the question of why, if this was such an important aspect of the prophecy, was it left out by the translators of the Septuagint, men whom the Church considers inspired by the Holy Spirit. I'm not sure if they thought it was an extraneous detail or what, but they did not include it. Now, Eliakim, he seems at first to have been a palace prefect or prime minister for King Hezekiah. He's mentioned in various places in the Old Testament. But there's significant evidence to warrant that he was actually a high priest who may have been functioning in the capacity as a palace prefect. There's little to no commentary on Isaiah 22, but one of the few pieces written by Eusebius of Caesarea, who granted is not a saint and granted had Arianizing tendencies, identifies Eliakim not as a prime minister or treasurer, but as the high priest. You can see here, he says, since you have been deposed and rejected from the high priesthood, speaking to Shebna, and then to Eliakim. But on the other hand, Eliakim, who has assessed as his good servant and slave, he will invest with their robe and will honor by placing on him the crown of the high priesthood. And then, Eusebius quotes the Septuagint, will give the glory of David. Notice Eusebius states Eliakim will be given the glory of David, and he's using the standard Septuagint used by the Church Fathers. Now, there is also considerable academic literature backing this up, particularly works by Catholic scholars, like Dr. Michael Patrick Barber, who's professor of scripture and theology, Dr. Brant Petrie, who's a professor of scripture and an expert in the Jewish roots of Christianity, as well as Professor John Bergsma, who's a professor of theology and an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They bring forward a strong case that Eliakim was none other than the high priest. The most succinct yet detailed and convincing case for this can be found in Dr. Barber's paper entitled Jesus as a Davidic Temple Builder and Peter's Priestly Role in Matthew 16:17. And in that paper, what is interesting is, and why Dr. Barber's paper makes more sense than other propositions, in my opinion, is that it makes more sense within Isaiah 22 and then makes a better comparison, I think, to Matthew 16. And Dr. Barber points out that it's not that Peter is a prime minister, he's actually a high priest. He says that Eliakim was seen as a high priestly figure, as clearly seen from the Targum on Isaiah 22. He is given a turban, said to wear a cincture, and receive the keys of the sanctuary. Likewise, the Midrash Rabbah specifically identifies Shebna, the man whose office Eliakim takes, as the high priest. How did ancient interpreters come to the conclusion that Eliakim was a priestly figure? This appears to be rooted in the language of the Hebrew text of Isaiah 22 itself. Eliakim is portrayed as wearing the garments, or a tunic, or a kethoneth in Hebrew, and a sash, which is an abnate in Hebrew, two garments specifically associated with the high priest. Indeed, Eliakim's role in the sanctuary may be suggested by Isaiah 22:24, where he's given authority over every small vessel, from the cups to all the flagons. Such table vessels appear elsewhere in context describing the cult, especially in connection with descriptions of the table and bread of presence. That the Septuagint additionally speaks of Eliakim's being crowned, in Greek stephanon, probably also relates to high priestly imagery, since we learn from other Jewish sources that the high priest was crowned, stephanon, and given the priestly language associated with Eliakim's role in Isaiah 22, it is probably significant that the imagery of keys, which are also associated with Eliakim in Isaiah 22, had priestly associations in ancient Israel, such as 1 Chronicles 9:27. The priest's responsibility involved the key of the temple. Barber, pages 944 through 945. Now, I would add to what Barber stated about those two Hebrew words for tunic and sash, kephoneth and abnate. They both appear as a pair in Isaiah 22:21. Now, those two terms appear all over the place in the Old Testament, but they only appear as pairs in these verses right here. And in all of these verses, they're describing priests. They're never describing a prime minister, never a treasurer, never anyone else, just priests. Dr. Barber then goes into some detail about the handing off of the key being a large part of the changing of the shifts for the priests on duty in the temple, including when the temple was sacked by the Babylonians. There's a Targum stating that the priests, they actually throw the key of the temple into the sky and give it back to God as a Targum. But Dr. Barber continues by saying, moreover, given the priestly imagery already found in Isaiah 22 and the fact that priests were associated with keys, it is not surprising that the Targum on Isaiah 22 specifically identifies the key given to Eliakim as the key of the sanctuary. In addition, each of the accounts relating the story of the keys of the temple being returned to the Lord includes specific mention of the fact that the priests had been unworthy stewards. The language appears to be closely tied to Isaiah's description of Eliakim's replacement of Shebna, which begins, "Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to this steward." In Greek, tamian. In Hebrew, I think it says sakon. Significantly, there's no other place in the Masoretic text where the terms steward and keys appear together. It should not be surprising then that the Talmud concludes this version of the legend with a quotation from Isaiah 22 itself. Same paper from Barber. So I think it's clear that Eliakim is the high priest. But as with everything, we have to go to the patristic commentary. And one of the few pieces of commentary on this section comes from St. Cyril of Alexandria, the hero of the Council of Ephesus and defender of the title Theotokos. And he's really one of the greatest exegetes in the church's history. Prior to his whole showdown with Nestorius, he was a champion commentary writer. But he compares Eliakim to Jesus Christ. You can see this. Then everyone who is glorious in the house of his Father will trust in Eliakim. Yet what is the house of Christ's Father if not the church? So he's drawing a direct parallel there. Now, these two interpretations, the one of Eusebius and of St. Cyril, they're not actually in contradiction, but they're complementary because Jesus Christ is the eternal high priest in the book of Hebrews. So by Eliakim being the high priest, he's ultimately a prefigurement of Jesus Christ, or eternal high priest. And we can see many examples of how Peter was to the New Testament, much like Aaron in the Old Testament. For example, in Exodus 24, Moses ascends a mountain to encounter God and brings with him Aaron and Aaron's two oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu. This is in parallel in Matthew 17 when Christ ascends Mount Tabor for the Transfiguration and brings with him Peter and then the two brothers, James and John, thus comparing Peter to Aaron the high priest. Just as Peter fell short after his appointment by Christ, so Aaron fell via the golden calf shortly after his appointment by God, and both had to be restored. There's even a paper by a guy named Phillips where he compares the role of Peter in the Gospel of John, or he talks about the Gospel of John as a stroll through the tabernacle, and he points out this absolutely incredible thing that I had not noticed, and that was the sepulcher that Christ is laid to rest in is the Holy of Holies in the temple. You have an angel sitting at the top, at one end of it, angel sitting at the other, just like the ark. Christ is laid to rest on the stone. The ark was laid to rest on the stone, right? And who is it who goes into the sepulcher first in John? It's Peter. John stays back. Only the high priest could go into the sepulcher. We see again in the book of Acts when Peter proclaims a new covenant to the people on the day of Pentecost. Recalls the priests reading the law to the people every 7 years in Deuteronomy. In fact, a Catholic convert from Judaism, Dr. Lawrence Feingold, and if you see a picture of this guy, I mean, the guy looks as Jewish as you can possibly get. I mean, he makes Jerry Seinfeld look like a Gentile. He's an associate professor of theology and philosophy. Associate professor of theology and philosophy at Kenrick Glennon Catholic Seminary in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, Missouri. And he brings up a fairly unnoticed one in Acts 1, which is when the apostles, led by Peter, want to assign a new apostle, they cast lots. And this seems really weird to us, like, what, you gotta throw dice? But this is nothing new because you would go to consult the high priest on something, he would then consult the Urim and the Thummim. And Feingold says this, he points out, after describing this and going into detail, I'll leave this up for a bit, he says, Peter has become the high priest of the new covenant. And so he not unnaturally took up a prerogative of the Aaronic high priesthood. Okay, so we can say that Peter is a high priest figure within the New Testament. He's the vicar of Christ. And as we can see in Matthew 16, the rock upon which the church is built according to most church fathers. Peter is the rock, okay? The Holy of Holies in the temple was built upon a rock. Christ is building his new community and a new temple. It needs to be built upon a rock. The temple sanctuary was built on a rock. This is really important. The high priest would sprinkle it with blood because the ark was gone. But this then begs a question. If Peter was the high priesthood must then correspond to the papacy, right? Wouldn't it mean that one high priest over the temple for the one shepherd over the church? Well, for this, we have to go into the church fathers and see what they equivocated to the high priesthood within the church. And we actually have a plethora of statements by them concerning this. The first is St. Clement of Rome, who wrote to the Corinthians, urging the congregation to desist in attempting to usurp the hierarchy. And you'll notice he writes this letter in the present tense, even though the temple had been destroyed probably 20 years before he wrote, okay? And he says, God has enjoined offerings, by whom he desires these things to be done. Those, therefore, who present their offerings at the appointed times are accepted and blessed, inasmuch as they follow. But then he draws this really interesting parallel. He says, for his own peculiar services are assigned to the high priest and their own proper places prescribed to the priests, and their own special ministrations devolved to the Levites. The layman is bound by the laws that pertain to laymen. He skipped down a bit and he goes, even though there are not offered in any place, but only at the altar before the temple, that which is offered being first carefully examined by the high priest and the ministers already mentioned. Okay, so he's drawing a parallel here. So just as we have bishops, priests, and deacons and laity, there's a high priest, there were the priests, there were the Levites, there was the laity. Okay, so we then get this from Dr. Feingold. Here he is. You see this picture of him. He look. He's. I mean, put a bagel in that guy's hand. He's. I mean, yeah. He's actually super interesting. If you, I'll post a link for you guys to see the article he writes. 6-7 pages. It's great. But Dr. Feingold says the worship of Israel was offered in a way stipulated directly by God in the Mosaic Law, such that particular offices are assigned to 4 classes of men: the high priests, the priests, the Levites, and the laymen. True worship is given to God when each one observes the laws pertaining to them. Likewise, in the New Covenant, these 4 classes remain. The bishop in each diocese takes the place of the high priest, and the priests of the New Covenant, referred to usually as presbyters in the early church, take the place of the old. The deacons take the place of the Levites, and the laity are those who have not received any of the grades of holy orders. Typology of Old Testament priesthood, page 4. Okay, so there we have it. The high priesthood is the bishop. So Peter's a high priest, the high priest is a bishop, right? Well, I mean, you need something more than that. But hold on, we go to St. Ignatius of Antioch, we see it again. Now, he's a martyr. He died, he's killed at about 107, maybe 110 AD. And he repeatedly emphasizes that the bishop is the vicar of Christ. Okay, you see this one. He says, we should look upon the bishop even as we would upon the Lord himself. In another letter, he says, while your bishop presides in the place of God and your presbyters in the place of the assembly of the apostles, along with your deacons who are most dear to me, are entrusted with the ministry of Jesus Christ. The ministry of Jesus Christ being care for the sick, the afflicted, the suffering. The deacon's job was to distribute alms, right? So bishop in the place of God, presbyters in the place of the apostles. You have, okay, Christ surrounded by the apostles, right? He then continues another one. He says, since you are subject to the bishops, or the bishop as to Jesus Christ, you appear to me to live not after the manner of men, but according to Jesus Christ who died for us. It is therefore necessary that as you indeed do so without the bishop, you should do nothing, but should also be subject to the presbytery as to the apostles of Jesus Christ. So there again you have it. Bishop is Jesus Christ's vicar, presbyters are vicars of the apostles. Another same letter. The bishop as Jesus Christ, who is the Son of the Father, and the presbyters is the Sanhedrin of God. The Sanhedrin of God, an assembly of the apostles. Who was surrounded by the Sanhedrin? The high priest. Who surrounded on this? By Jesus Christ. He's surrounded by them on his trial. At his trial. But you see this here. He draws this direct parallel between the bishop and the high priest and Jesus Christ. Okay, and then you see like Saint Hippolytus of Rome. He writes in about 235, and this is his. He writes this work called The Apostolic Tradition, and he continually draws a parallel between the high priesthood and the bishop, and he does it in the consecration prayer of a bishop. He goes that he, the candidate for episcopal consecration, will feed your holy flock, that he will wear your high priesthood without reproach. He then goes on, in the spirit of the high priesthood, have the power to forgive sins according to your commandment, to assign lots according to your commandment, to loose any bond according to authority which you gave the apostles. Okay, so we see it there too. Let's see, where am I here? Okay, if you go into that document of St. Hippolytus in chapters 8 and 34, he also refers to the bishop as a high priest. And we even see this in the Syriac tradition, interestingly enough, an early document that does not have any likely date or sustainable date, but it's very early, probably first 2 centuries. it says, the apostles further appointed, let there be elders and deacons like the Levites, and subdeacons like those who carried the vessels of the court of the sanctuary of the Lord, and an overseer who shall likewise be the guide of all the people, like Aaron, the head and the chief of all the priests and Levites of the whole city. Notice also the similarity in dress between Orthodox bishop and the high priest. That's from the Syriac teachings of the apostles. 5. So wait, if Eliakim is a high priest who prefigures Peter, and if Peter is a high priest figure in the New Testament, and if Peter is a vicar of Christ, and if the bishop is a vicar of Christ, and the bishop is the high priest, that means Peter is the archetype of all bishops, and therefore all bishops are successors to Peter. So wait, stop and think about that for a moment, everyone here, okay? Eliakim is a high priest and prefigures a New Testament high priesthood. Peter is a vicar of Christ. The bishop is the vicar of Christ. The bishop is Peter. Peter is the archetype of all bishops. Each bishop is the high priest, and therefore each bishop holds a place of Peter because Peter is the high priest. Now, St. Cyprian of Carthage was martyred in 258. He echoes the sentiments of St. Clement, Ignatius, and Hippolytus when he says, our Lord, describing the honor of a bishop and the order of his church, speaks in the gospel and says to Peter, I say to thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind upon earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thau shalt bind on earth shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And then he says, thence through the changes of time and succession, the ordering of bishops and plan of the church flows onward, so that the church is founded upon the bishops, and every act of the church is controlled by the same rulers. But notice that, describing the honor of a bishop, and then he quotes Matthew 16, 17 through 19. Now, St. John Chrysostom makes a similar one. He says about John 21, 15, 17, he goes, another papal proof text. He goes, Peter, do you love me? He says, feed my sheep. And having asked him a third time, declares this to be an infallible proof of love. But not to priests only is this said. Notice that. He points out that it's said to priests, but to any one of us also who are also entrusted with a little flock. So he doesn't understand it as being pointed to a pope per se, but really any bishop. And St. John Chrysostom, later in his book on the priesthood, he says something similar when he's talking to his friend Basil, not Basil the Great, different Basil. He talks about John 21, 15, 19. And he says to Basil, will you then still contend that you were not rightly deceived when you are about to superintend the things which belong to God and are doing that which Peter did? The Lord said he should be able to surpass the rest of the apostles. For his words were, Peter, do you love me more than these? St. John Chrysostom ties that proof text to bishops, right? Bishops are high priests. And St. Augustine of Hippo, the great exegete of the West, fantastic saint. Anyone should read a lot about the life of St. Augustine. Extremely inspiring. He takes the same John 21, 15 through 17, and he points it towards pastors. He goes, let not those then who feed Christ's sheep be lovers of their own selves, lest they feed them as if they were their own and not his. How much more ought those to contend to death for the truth, and even to blood against sin, who are entrusted by him with the feeding, that is, with the teaching, governing of these very sheep, who can fail to see that the shepherds ought all the more to set themselves closely to imitate Peter. Pope St. Leo the Great says it too. He goes, because the type, Suan, you're a philosophy guy, you love types, right? Because the type form of Peter is proposed. Hey, I knew you'd pick up on the type, right? Because the type or forma in Latin of Peter is proposed to all pastors of the church. Therefore, the privilege of Peter dwells wherever the judgment is given with his equity. Typically in Platonism, and St. Leo was heavily influenced by St. Augustine, who had a very strong Platonist background. A type is the true form of something. It's the true thing itself. So the true essence of Peter is proposed to all the pastors of the church, he says. Okay, so he's engaging in Old Testament typology. And then you see this Afrahat the Persian, who was a writer in the Syriac school. He also takes Matthew 21, 15, 17 and goes, he addresses it to pastors. He goes, so Simon fed his sheep, and he fulfilled his time and handed over the flock to you. And he starts out the verse by saying, O ye pastors. Okay. One of the most influential writers in the Greek tradition, Pseudo-Dionysius, who's used repeatedly by St. Maximus the Confessor, he identifies Peter as an archetype or the type of bishops, right? He says, and to the one enlightened by the sacred revelation of the all-holy Father, it is said in Scripture, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Thus Peter himself and all the hierarchs like him have had the judgment of the Father revealed to them, and being themselves men who provided revelation and explanation, they have the task of admitting the friends of God and keeping away the ungodly. By the way, when it talks about the key in Revelation 3:7, this is typically how it's understood, that he can open and close the gates of heaven to people. So then he continues, similarly, God's hierarchs must use their powers of excommunication as well as their other hierarchical powers to the extent that they are moved by the divinity, which is the source of every right. Okay. Then you have this great line. I mean, even later on, I mean, even in the 800s, you see it from St. Theodore the Studite, who he takes the words of Matthew 16, 17 through 19, and he applies it on to the apostles and their successors. Now, we know he's not quoting Matthew 18:18 because he says, he gives the verse in the singular. Whatsoever you bind upon earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose upon earth shall be loosed in heaven. Okay? I believe in the Greek, when you look at St. Theodore Studite, he uses a singular for it. Anyway, let's see here. Next one. We have, you even see popping up in the British Isles with St. Gildas, among others. And he speaks of the bishop as sitting on the throne of Peter after talking about just the absolute sleazebags who are being promoted as bishops. St. Gildas says, some of them usurping with unclean feet the seat of the apostle Peter, but for the demerit of their covetousness falling down into the pestilent chair of the traitor Judas. You even see this in the Coptic tradition. There's a story about Shenut. He died in 466, so slightly after Chalcedon. But he's speaking with Jesus, and the bishop comes to talk to him. And Shenut goes, I'm not going to talk to the bishop. And Jesus looks at Shenut and goes, Shenut, arise and go out to the bishop, lest he excommunicate you. Otherwise, I cannot let you enter heaven because of the covenant I made with Peter, saying, what you will bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you will loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so Shenut gets up, he goes out there, talks to the bishop, who hopefully was very understanding. So going back to the earlier discussion on Eliakim as high priest,
time's up.
Peter's Oh, okay. All
Maybe
right. Well, that's that.
Well, let him finish his sentence at least, you know.
Okay.
Oh, there's just there's like 2 sentences. Is that all right?
Yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
Lewis, I didn't mean to take
So
over.
it says,
I just wanted to be fair to Ubi, yeah.
oh, thanks. Let's see. Going back to earlier discussion on Eliakim as high priest, Peter's prefigured by Eliakim, and Peter's presented as a high priest of the new Israel, that's a church. And the New Testament, each bishop is a high priest, and therefore each bishop is Peter. Further, the bishop is Christ's vicar. Peter is also Christ's vicar, therefore bishops are vicars of Christ. And each diocese is a temple. Okay, done. Thank you, Swan.
Yeah, that's all right. I imagine there's more there you could probably flesh out in the talk. If you're enjoying this discussion debate, please hit like, subscribe, consider subscribing to Patreon, where there's all the extra stuff. Ubi answers direct questions on there, like as from waking up till his bedtime. So I thought what would be a good idea would be for oh, and by the way, I was only interrupting because it's like I need to be strict on so that there's equal time. But yeah, I think what would be best is maybe Suan, do you want to start asking Ubi questions, because that's usually how it goes in a formal debate. So, but it's just kind of back and forth anyway. So
could we take a 2-minute pause real quickly? I need to get a drink of water.
Sure. Yeah. If Suan's cool with that.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. Yeah.
Let's see, Lewis. Did anybody else call me Kim Jong Un in the chat or?
I didn't see
me?
anyone. I didn't see anyone do it.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I found that very funny as well.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know that I did stalk your Facebook. Well, I totally didn't stalk your Facebook to find that picture or anything, but yeah.
Yeah. That one I took at the end of high school. That's when I had more hair, Is that Ubi in the background? That little sound that I was hearing?
I think so, yeah. Just mute him. But yeah, I find this discussion very interesting. I used to be a lot more into the kind of the Roman Catholic stuff, but then now I'm like, I don't know, I'm more interested in the Islamic stuff right now, which is why I've got a channel with Kai currently.
Mm-hmm.
Because I went through kind of a similar process of trying to pick religion.
Yeah, and you're Orthodox, right?
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm also. Yeah, I'm a convert from atheism, so.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you rather than being an atheist. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'm probably going to get canceled for saying that. But
Okay.
There, Ruby. Cool. So yeah, just go ahead and have a back and forth, and yeah. By the way, Ubi, you have an echo, so you might want to put in some headphones or something. I don't know.
Oh.
But, no, yeah, just go ahead. Just go ahead like this. Never mind. I think it doesn't. I think it's not that bad when you're actually talking. So yeah.
Okay, here. So, let me mute myself while everyone else is.
Okay. So go ahead, Suan. You can just start the ball rolling.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see here. Okay. So let's go through first kind of the arguments you gave for Peter being a high priest, which I actually, that does have support, and the things that you mentioned about the keys. And actually, before I get to my question, I just want to compliment you, Ubi, for your presentation. I think by far you have presented like the best objections that I've encountered, and the fact that you take the argument seriously, the scholarship, the patristics and the history. That's highly respectable, and I think that this makes this debate like that much better. Having you here having you here discussing and presenting that evidence. So thank you.
You're too kind. I'm not worthy of your words, but thank you.
Oh, come on. All right. So yeah, when you say that Peter's the high priest, Peter's the high priest because Eliakim is a high priest figure. I mean, I think you and I would both agree with that. Because clearly in the Davidic monarchy, there wasn't a sharp distinction between church and state. So this idea of the legal officials or the administrative officials having religious roles is not unheard of. For instance, so I wanted to ask you, though, I mean, isn't it possible that Peter could be both a figure of a high priest and a prime minister?
Oh, yeah, he could be. I mean, like you said, the roles were not necessarily clear cut. I think one thing that I think plays into this as well, if you don't mind me sort of kind of going off a bit, but coming back, is that all of the kings of Israel were priests, right? This is why David is able to eat the showbread.
Mm-hmm.
And they're priests after the order of Melchizedek, because they were kings of Salem, which became Jerusalem, right? And so you basically have this priestly class that are ruling the city or ruling the empire. And so there's really no reason to assume that Eliakim could not be a prime minister. It's just I think he was first and foremost a high priest, and that's where I see the connection. And I think he then doubled as a prime minister.
Yeah, sure. So, for instance, like in 2 Kings 18:18, this is something that Roland DeVoe brought up, and I guess I'll bring it up as well. So it says in 2 Kings 18:18, when they called out for the king, there came out to them Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace. And then it mentioned Shebna, the secretary, and Joas, son of Asaph, the recorder. So, I mean, here, right, we're seeing that Eliakim is identified as being in charge of the palace. To me, that sounds
to be. I mean, we know that the master of the palace was a prime ministerial figure, right? And it seems to be what is primarily used to identify him, right, as having whatever the keys, the glory over the house of David. So I think what I'm suggesting here is that I think clearly we both agree that it's both. It's not one or the other. Although you're making the emphasis that it's primarily a high priest or the high priest role.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then. Yeah. So then can you tell me again, like, why do you, so for instance, I wouldn't really make this distinction between him being primarily high priest or being prime minister. I would just say that he's both equally and relevantly. So maybe help me understand what was the point of that distinction, because I'm not too sure, if it's really a relevant distinction, if you will.
Well, the distinction would be that the connection is primarily through Eliakim being the high priest versus simply being the prime minister. Now, for Lewis and I, because we live within the Byzantine tradition, there's plenty of examples of bishops being, having high up positions within the empire's administration. And so for us, it's not really strange to see that. The other thing is that in that verse you quoted, I believe the term that's used is not master of the palace. I believe it's master of the house. And house itself in Hebrew is regularly used to refer to the temple. The temple was the king's temple. It was that he built it, right? The Temple of David, or Temple of Solomon, right? So I would have to do specific research into what is being said there and look at targums and this and that before I could really delve into it. But I do believe that the link is primarily the link between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22 is primarily through Eliakim being a high priest.
Okay, so that's good. So then I think that provides some clarification there. Yeah, I mean, I think this will play out in the course of our discussion. But for instance, because for instance, what I want to say is that I think it can be both, right? So, for instance, we know that the prime minister was given the keys of the house, and then you're saying that this is the high priest, right? So that's good. So then it's both the keys of the temple of the house of David, and sorry, I'm trying to get through my thoughts here. Yeah, okay. So the high priest could simultaneously serve as a prime minister. Okay, good. Never mind. Okay, so I'm gonna move on from there. So then I was also interested too on if you had any comments about the Joshua typology that I made in John 21:15-17, because the arguments that I use there, they predate the fathers, and they are within the first century only. So these are the earliest historical sources talking about Joshua receiving the throne of Moses, right? And for instance, I mean, even though you say that Peter is a type of all bishops, which I don't think is unobjectionable, I don't think it's objectionable on a Catholic perspective, right? You would also recognize that historically speaking, there were men who were recognized as the unique, distinct successors of Peter.
By lineage, yes, of course, bishops of Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. But
then also, if I may, though, but also, like, for instance, going back to Matthew 16:19, you would also recognize that the keys for the office of prime minister were also only held by one person: Shebna, Azra, Ahishar, and I forgot who the last Jotham, right? So these were held by one person only.
Right, and just as the high priesthood was held by one person only.
Okay, good.
I mean, but the church fathers have no problem saying that many people hold it. Right,
so the keys, right, of the high priesthood were only held by one person. But then we also know from research done on the Davidic monarchy that this particular king, this particular high priest, or as you call it, or the vizier, he could also make rulings that no one under the king could override. So even though, let's say, the high priest during the Second Temple, didn't have the power to make rulings under the king, second in command, because there was no king at the time. Or at least Israel wasn't as it had once been. But then during the time of David, when you had the king, the high priest, the prime minister, as I mentioned with the New Bible Commentary, opening and shutting meant the power to make rulings under which no one under the king could override. He's second in command to the king. He's deputized to make binding decisions on his behalf. So notice that in the Old Testament, then, the typology, which we're debating right now, the keys can only be had by one person. This one person was second in command to the king. That seems to me pretty significant in terms of distinguishing this high priest from the others, singular high priest from the others.
Okay, so there were also keys to the temple. There was a key to it specifically. And so I would say the significance of Matthew 16, 17 through 19 is that Peter gets keys, plural. He's getting the key to the house of David. He's getting the key to the temple.
Yeah.
So the person has a key to the temple. That's a very specific position. The priest would hand off the key to one another at the end of a shift. And as mentioned, you have like when the Babylonians take it, the Jews, there's a story from one of the Targums that they throw the key up into heaven and they give it back to God. They say we've been unworthy stewards of it. So simply there being keys doesn't mean prime minister. It just means someone's in a custodial position. And I see no reason to say that it should be a prime minister versus simply a high priest.
Right.
In fact, it was actually... Yes, sorry, please.
No, sorry. I don't want to interrupt, but so we're moving now into the New Testament, but I just want to focus on the Old Testament first, because I feel like we have to establish what exactly Eliakim was before we can start talking about the comparisons to Peter. Does that sound like a fair course of action?
Sure.
Yeah, because and the reason why I'm doing this is not to be difficult, right? But because I think that if we're operating under a different idea on who Eliakim was or what he was, then that's going to end up affecting how we approach Matthew 16, 19, right? So I want to be fair with the audience in the debate itself. So for instance, clearly you and I both agree, right? Matthew 16, 19, Isaiah 22, 22. We both recognize that that they're typological parallels.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, so when it talks about the power of opening and shutting, usually speaking, the scholars will apply that to the palaces in Jerusalem, but you would also want to apply that to the temple, correct?
Well, the primary place that had keys was the temple, and there was an entire ceremony around the temple about handing off of keys. And so when I think it's Dr. Brant Petrie, to the audience, if anyone gets a chance to watch Dr. Brant Petrie's videos, he's a Catholic apologist. He does a very, very good one called The Jewish Roots of the Papacy, and he goes into like tremendous detail about this. I'm sure, Suan, you've seen the video I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good video, right? So there's this entire ceremony about handing off of the keys, and at one point, a priest actually has to sleep on top of the keys. He puts them into a stone box. He puts the slab on top of the stone box with the keys in it. Then he puts his mattress on and he sleeps. And he's the keeper of the keys. He's totally responsible for them. It's not that I don't think there are keys to other things. It's I just think that the main comparison is to keys of the temple. I mean, this is also at a time when you have a lot of temple movements like the Essenes who believe they're establishing a new temple, right? You have Jesus Christ as the new David. David was a priestly figure and a king figure because he was a descendant from, or he held the position of the king of Jerusalem, order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the first king of Salem, this and that. That's why the apostles were able to eat the showbread, because they had priestly authority, and Christ is claiming a priestly authority for himself. He goes, yes, I'm a successor of David, but I'm also priestly authority. Okay. Now, what you said about... Oh, sorry, I'm sorry?
No, I don't want to interrupt you. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, what you said about Moses giving the power to Joshua, okay? So in every synagogue, there's a Moses seat, right? And that's a seat of teaching, correct?
Yep.
Okay. Mm-hmm. In every single Orthodox church is a bishop's seat, and that is a seat of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so the parallels there we would draw is not Moses as the king, Moses as a ruler, but Moses as a spiritual leader, as the lawgiver in that way.
Yeah, I mean, so Ubi, I think what's good here is that I think we're both latching on to like the same analogies, and I think there's a lot that we'd agree with, right? Because I, as a Catholic, I wouldn't say that the bishops aren't also vicars of Christ, right? I'm also not going to say that a bishop, that Peter isn't a type for all of these shepherds of the new Israel, all the bishops, right? Although I'm going to say that there is something unique about Peter, such that he is distinguished in such a way that is successional, supreme, and infallible. So, for instance, like, let me propose this counterinterpretation now with respect to Eliakim. So, I would agree that Eliakim is, so Eliakim is clearly, a high priest. The keys are used in the temple, right? And the priests have the keys. But then also, Eliakim is the one high priest who can also serve as prime minister in the Davidic monarchy, right? So sure, all the other high priests, they have keys of some sort, but it seems as if Eliakim uniquely receives these keys, well, and over the house of David, or over the temple, if you will, but also he gets this unique administrative authority, where, as I stated from the various sources, like Roland DeVoe in his book on ancient Israel's life and institutions, he would, it says all the affairs of the land passed through his hands, all important documents received his seals, all officials in the palace, right, were under his orders. He was like the Egyptian vizier, the highest official of the state. So my point would be this. My point would be this, Ubi. Eliakim, sure, he can be a high priest, but he is the only singular high priest who can also be prime minister. Okay, now when we get to the New Testament, Jesus, as the son of David, as the new David, in fulfillment of the prophecy in 2 Samuel 7, rebuilds the Davidic monarchy in a very literal sense, in a very physical, literal sense, as was the expectation of the Jews. And that what I'd argue here is that if we have the typology, we have the similarities between Peter and Eliakim, we have the physical literalness of the Davidic monarchy being rebuilt in the New Testament, then I, as a Catholic, would seem to be justified in saying, well, yeah, Peter's a high priest, he's the type for all priests, but he is unique in that he is the prime minister, a position that not all the other high priests or priests are in the New Covenant, just as in the Old. So that would be how I approach the issue. Yeah.
Right. So I understand that, and those are very good objections. And the way I would answer it is this: in Israel, there was only one place where the sacrifices could be made, and that was the temple. Only one place, no other place. In the New Testament, in the Christian Church, the sacrifice of the Mass can be performed by any bishop, and that's because every bishop is the high priest. Every diocese is the temple. So we would take your model that you have and simply multiply it out and say, yes, that is true. It is a new Israel. Yes, he is the one who holds both keys, the house of David and the house of the temple, and that's the diocese. Whereas for you, you would approach and go, that's Rome, and then you have all these sort of synagogues. I mean, I'm not saying that you're saying that. I'm saying that this is sort of what I'm getting from you, is that would be the Pope, and then you have these synagogues, so to say, or miniature temples that then have Eliakims of their own or Peters of their own. We would instead say that every diocese is the temple, that every diocese is the restored kingdom of David. That's the ecclesiology of St. Ignatius of Antioch, right? That the bishop, surrounded by his presbyters with the deacons and the laity, that constitutes the Catholic Church right there, each diocese. And so this then gets into synodality.
Right. Or, I mean, I think it also gets into our concept of Israelology, right? So what do we think is the nature of the new Israel? Or I think that's basically what you were saying, right? Because for me, as I stated, for instance, in my point on originalism, the Jews, they really did believe that the Davidic monarchy was coming back through the son of David. So they really, so what they believed was, the son of David would come, the Messiah, and he would defeat Rome, right? And what I'm saying here is that what I want to do in my apologetic is stay as close to the Jewish roots as I can, without doing this kind of revisionism that often happens. Oh, well, no, it wasn't a physical kingdom. It was only a spiritual kingdom. Or, you know, like Jesus' kingdom was not on this world. It's because Jesus said it's not of this world, although that's butchering what Jesus says in John's gospel. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I guess, so yeah, I mean, where I would come from then is I want to say, no, like Jesus in a very literal physical sense rebuilt the Davidic monarchy. Now, as you pointed out, right, I mean, like, and you know, in AD 70, the temple was destroyed. So we didn't really have, you know, a central kind of physical, let's say, building or temple on the earth in which we could all go for the sacrifice, but even like, you know, Christ's sacrifice on the cross in the Eucharist, we simply reparticipate in that, right? So we don't have to, for instance, repeat the rites of Yom Kippur in the temple, because Jesus, as our high priest, has done the ultimate sacrifice. We just merely reparticipate in it, right?
But
so,
we still
I mean,
call it the sacrifice of the Mass.
Right. So, I mean, Ubi, would you agree that at least you could see where I'm coming from as a Catholic with kind of, you could see where I'm coming from, right? So maybe you don't find it compelling, but you at least could see where I'm coming from here.
Oh, I see where you're coming from, yeah. And I understand your logic behind it, that there's one temple, one shepherd. That's why I said in the presentation that there's, you know, one temple, one shepherd, you know, that would correspond to the Pope, right, in the Catholic mind.
Right, yeah.
Whereas for us, that would correspond to the bishop. Now, Lewis does a really good video, I should say this, called Christian Worship and the Old Testament. And it's at his group, Orthodox Shahada, or his YouTube channel, Christian Worship and the Old Testament. And not only is it narrated in an absolutely fabulous British accent, but and the illustrations are phenomenal, the visuals great, but he goes into tremendous detail about the similarities between the Orthodox Christian worship, right, and the temple worship, and how they correspond to each other. And if you look at the high priestly robes and how the high priest is looked at, and then you look at, say, like the bishop, right, regardless of whether it's, you know, Orthodox or Catholic or Coptic or whatever, you see the similarity and the symbolism behind what the various vestments mean. You see that the bishop sits in the chair of Moses. You see that the sacrifice of the Mass can be given at one place, and that's under the bishop, or, as St. Ignatius says, someone whom the bishop appoints, that being a priest. So what I would, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this now we can move on then to discussion on the throne or the seat of Moses, as you put it, or as you presented most recently. I mean, so for instance, you're right. I mean, so once again, I want to commend you on your scholarship, because you're right that there is at the front of Jewish synagogues, especially, you know, dating back to even, you know, the earliest archaeological sites that we can find, there was a spot, I believe, where the teacher would sit, and I think it's referred back to the Grimatrius or something along those lines, right? So, for instance, Wolfgang Schrag, he noted that the throne of Moses, or the seat of Moses, was the symbol of all the Pharisees, of all the rabbis, in a sense, to be vested with the authority of Moses, right? But then, as you pointed out, right, there is, in some sense, that authority is honorific, although it is real in many respects, right? But it reaches its most solemn or exceptional or extraordinary point in the Sanhedrin, right? And as you know, the Sanhedrin is typically composed of, the sources kind of differ. They say 70, 71, 72. Eventually, the office of high priest in the Sanhedrin split into two. So then you have the high priest and the Nasi, or the prince of the court. That's kind of going into the weeds. But basically, even in Judaism, there's this recognition that the throne of Moses represents not only the general authority, right, of all the rabbis and the Pharisees, but also the unique, solemn, and extraordinary authority of the particular body, which is the Sanhedrin, right, or the high court itself. You would agree with that, right? Yeah. So then what I would want to do, so just to kind of like now show my hand, right, my strategy, what I'd want to do is I want to say, so as you as an Orthodox would recognize that, I, as a Catholic, would want to recognize that. Although I would want to emphasize, right, that Peter, in receiving the throne of Moses, also becomes a one-man Supreme Court. And that's probably where we're going to differ, right, in terms of interpretation.
Okay, so back to that comment by Saint Ignatius of Antioch, where he talks about the apostles forming the Sanhedrin of the bishop, right? The apostles are the Sanhedrin, the presbyters are the Sanhedrin. So each diocese is a Sanhedrin, and it should be noted that there were many Sanhedrins that were composed of 23 individuals that were all over the place in major cities.
Those were the lower tribunals,
Yeah, and then there was the big one, right, that would handle big things. So we would look at a Sanhedrin that way, and we would say it's it's an ecumenical council, we would say. You have all of the successors of Peter gathered together, making a decision. Now, I would have a hard time saying that the entirety of the Sanhedrin would be, I would have a hard time seeing and saying how the Sanhedrin would be the chair of Moses, the entire Sanhedrin itself, how it could become, let me rephrase this. I would have a hard time seeing how and then saying that the entirety of the Sanhedrin could just be reduced down to the Nasi or Prince of, I mean, as you mentioned, it was the high priest until 191, and they split it and they made him the Nasi after that. But I don't quite see could you go into more detail about that?
No, excellent. So here, one thing I'd point out too is that even I think, the Nasi serves as an important symbol. So for instance, you're right that the Nasi on his own could not make a ruling. He could not, for instance, ex cathedra, sit in the throne of Moses, right, and say this is the ruling of the court. He had to be in participation with his brother judges, right? But also what you see is that if the Nasi was not present at the council, no matter how many men you got together, no matter how intelligent and bright, even if they were validly ordained, right, and could trace their ordination back to Joshua and to Moses, if the Nasi wasn't present, then the council had no authority.
Correct.
Right. And then so what I'd say here is that if Peter is the Nasi of all Nazis, right, if he is, this head Nasi, so to speak, you can have all the other Nazis, right? But if you're going to rule on the church at large and you don't have the Nasi of all Nazis, right, then the council, like, there's something intrinsically missing. So, I mean, that's one point that I'd make. So this is not to deny that the lower tribunals could make rulings, right? But you couldn't make this, it wouldn't be the same as the Great Sanhedrin making a ruling over all of Israel herself, right?
Of course, it was. If I may interject for a moment.
Yeah. Of course.
Just for the audience, the lower Sanhedrin would typically take care of day-to-day matters within the community. They would answer things like so-and-so stole my cow, or so-and-so stole my goat, or so-and-so stole my chicken. Probably a lot of chicken theft going on, but they would answer things like that, and then issues of religious observance, like if there was actually a question that did not have a pre-formulated answer, it would go to the higher Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and that's the one that that Suan and I are talking about now.
Yeah. Good.
Sorry, continue.
No, okay, and yeah, it's just, I'm having a good time. Yeah, and then the second point that I'd make. So the first point I would make is that, okay, so I would try to make this point that if Peter is kind of the high priest type, right, or all bishops are types of Peter, right, then in some sense, then, Peter would be the high priest of high priests, the Nasi of Nasi, right? So he would, if we're going to talk about now, not just like the local Nasi, the local, right, synod or whatever, but we're talking about the entire church at large, then I think you would need, Peter in some sense himself, right? The one who is the type of all the types. That's an inference that I think you're free to reject. But at least that's one way that I would reverse the argument, right? The second thing that I'd want to mention is just kind of the history of the throne of Moses itself. So, in the Avot of Rabbi Natan, it describes the succession of the high court from Moses to the Pharisees. And the point that that Rabbi Natan makes is that originally Moses, right, lays his hands on Joshua in Deuteronomy 34:9. Some of Moses' authority goes to Joshua. And then Joshua, he passes on what the Pharisees believe to be the oral Torah. And Joshua ends up forming, the earliest courts. Joshua is the one who, with all the authority of the throne of Moses, begins to disperse that authority, right? So he begins to decide how it's distributed. So then at one time, then, the high court was only in one person, right?
Right.
And then the point that I'd want to make here is that in the case of Peter, right? In the case of Peter, one is that, I'd want to emphasize, the singular nature of the prime ministerial office. But here I'd also want to emphasize that if Peter specifically ordained particular men, right, then I think that in itself, is incredibly significant. And let's see here. But then I think you would also, you would acknowledge, right? Yeah, you would acknowledge then that Peter also distributed his authority among not just the Bishop of Rome, but other bishops, correct?
Yes, in fact, there's actually a tradition from the Roman Catholic saint, Sir Robert Bellarmine, Robert Bellarmine. I don't think he was a sir. Yeah, I don't think he was a sir.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he stated that Peter ordained the other apostles, and that tradition does pop up from time to time. So in that sense, all of the apostles have a lineage from Peter in that sense. Now, that is not a majority tradition. It is, but it is definitely there, lurking in the background.
Yeah, good.
I just thought I'd bring that up and just sort of throw that in there.
Yeah, and then I think the other example I wanted to bring up then was specifically now going into Acts chapter 5, because I think in Acts chapter 5, we see Peter acting alone, using his binding and loosing power in such a way that he alone could manifest the power of the high court and be immediately and dramatically backed by God on the spot. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, so let me pitch that to you and just see how would you approach Acts chapter 5?
Well, the same way, and say every bishop is Peter, and go back to that comment by St. Ignatius of Antioch about the presbyters of the Sanhedrin sitting around the bishop. In the bishop's diocese, I mean, he's the guy who gives the rulings. It's that simple. He is an autocrat within his own diocese, and then they come together. So for ecumenical councils. So going back to what you said about can you make a decision without the Nasi of Nasis? In our ecclesiology, you have to have the participation of all of the patriarchates in order to have a valid ecumenical council. Now, some would say, well, how could you have a valid ecumenical council if you no longer have Rome? And the answer is, we actually look at the See of Rome as vacant. We are sede vacantis in that sense, not Most Holy Family trailer stary. Those guys, Bob and Fred. You look at their place; it just looks like they sit around drinking Coors Light all day. But anyway, we would say, Rome is vacant, and so in that sense, there's no one there, and we wait for the day when there is a healing, or whether we just end up installing a bishop of Rome on their own. Until then, that mantle of authority has fallen onto the Patriarch of Constantinople. So that's how we could have that's how we would answer the Nasi of Nasis. Yeah.
Do you mind if, so I'll just ask a clarification question on Acts 5, right? I mean, so you would accept, right, that Peter was made head shepherd of Israel, and in himself he was seated on the throne of Moses.
He's of the new Israel.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So then
you would say that.
No, I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, we would say that he is he is the head shepherd, and that every diocese, and this is a paradigm that we function in, right? Every diocese is the temple. That's the same paradigm that St. Clement of Rome is speaking about.
So, but would you
if you have a high
accept?
priest, you have a temple.
But okay, so would you accept that Peter is a successor to Christ in the same way that Joshua was a successor to Moses?
Well, Joshua was a secular, as secular as it could get back then. He was a warlord, so I would not say so. I mean, if you want to talk about in terms of like spiritual warfare, sure, but I would have to think further on that.
Right. So I mean, it's not entirely univocal. I think we would agree, because like, you know, the new Israel is not necessarily getting into wars and battles over the Promised Land.
It does sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. But for instance, I mean, so the succession of Joshua from Moses, it was unique, it was singular. In him was all of the legal authority of Moses, and it was for him to decide how the power would be distributed. Would you agree with that? For Peter.
For Peter?
Yeah.
I mean, you could draw a parallel. I wouldn't say it's the exact parallel.
Sure.
There's a lot of examples of handing off power. You know, Elijah hands it off to Elisha. To be honest with you, I would have to look at patristic commentaries first to know exactly what to think, what is within the actual patristic mindset of Joshua, of Moses handing over power to Joshua. But I mean, as you said, Moses gives some of it to Joshua, some of it to others, right? He doesn't give it entirely to Joshua.
Well, I mean, so when it says some, right, it says some in Deuteronomy 34:9. Although later on in rabbinic tradition, they eventually say like it was all concentrated into Joshua, who then redistributed the power. I think the point here is that the reason why it says some in Deuteronomy 34:9 is because you can't really repeat what Moses did, because Moses was the unique first redeemer and type for the Messiah, right? And Joshua, in a way, participates in that, but not in the same extremity as Moses, right? Yeah, I mean, so there's a way to get around that without necessarily saying that, oh, there was power here and then power given beyond Joshua. Well, all the power was vested into Joshua, and then Joshua was the one who had the authority to decide how that power would be distributed into Israel. At least that's how the rabbinic sources portray it. And I cited, Sifra Pinhas, the Petrat Moshe, which is later, and the Assumption of Moses to justify that interpretation. Okay, do you mind if I just
when were those written, by the way?
The Petrat Moshe, the Petrat Moshe was written about 1,000 years after Christ, and then the Sifra Pinhas and the Assumption of Moses. Some people debate when the Assumption was written. It was either written in the 1st or 2nd century, and then Sifra Pinhas, insofar as I can tell, I think it was 2nd century. Yeah. So still incredibly close to the time. And then, some people might kind of knock at the Petrat Moshe for being written in the 1,000 years later. Although like in New Testament scholarship, that isn't terribly problematic. And I mean, I can go into examples why, but for instance, like the Avraham Petra Midrash in the 13th century is still used by scholars to figure out what was believed in the 1st century about Abraham's status as the Rock of Israel. So that's not like a big deal that it's 1,000 years later, although it's not the best. So that's why you include the other sources. But yeah. Yeah. So Ubi, do you mind if I just kind of summarize how I think the debate has gone, and then I'll get your summary?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, good. So, right. Yeah, so I just, in today's debate, I presented 2 standards, and this is not my closing statement. I just want to summarize for the audience's sake and for our sake. So I presented 2 standards, right? One is that we can identify interpretations that are valid versus interpretations that are compelling. And then we talked about originalism. Now, when it comes to Peter being the new Eliakim, Ubi and I accept the typology. We accept that even Peter could be the typological fulfillment of Eliakim. We have no problem saying that. I think the key difference here, no pun intended, it's whether. Thank you. It's whether or not, right? So, for instance, what I want to say is that Eliakim is the one high priest who has the unique authority from among the other high priests to be second in command to the king, and that seems to be how the Davidic monarchy was constructed in the Old Testament, right? And then what I want to say is that in the New Testament, Jesus brings in the Davidic monarchy once again, fulfilling Jewish messianic prophecy in a very literal, real way, strengthening our apologetic to our Jewish brothers and sisters, such that the more physical and literal and univocal one takes the Davidic monarchy of the Old Testament into the New Testament, so too does the univocity of the office of prime minister in the Old Testament carry over to the New Testament. And hence we see with Peter, there could have been singular succession from him, right, to singular other bishops of over the church, or universal bishops or universal prime ministers. And I think here, when it comes to Peter being the new Joshua, like, yeah, I think Ubi, you did a good job, because what you could say is like all these great things can be predicated of Peter without necessarily translating to his successors, right? Because at most, what I could say is that with the succession, the rabbis would use the laying on of hands to institute their successors and give them their binding and loosing power. Peter received the power to bind and loose, and so did the other apostles, although I would argue that the keys give him a unique kind of bent to his authority or his binding and loosing powers. But the point here then is that I think what you could say is you could accept all these things about Peter being head rabbi. You could accept all these things about Peter being, Joshua and so on and so forth. But then you can avoid it by talking about how, well, the new Joshua typology doesn't entail singular succession. Yeah, which is good. Do you have any thoughts on my arguments about the importance of Rome?
Well, I would say that, you made an argument, a very good one, about Christ conquers the kingdom, he reestablishes it, right?
Yeah.
So with the reestablishment of the kingdom, and this is where you could take this argument fairly easily. You could go, well, Rome was a pagan empire. When it converted to Christianity, it needed a new capital without a pagan history, therefore Constantinople. Because what does St. Constantine do almost immediately? He establishes Constantinople. He names it after himself. He calls it New Rome, right? So you could take the argument that way. So that's what I would say to that. I would also add in that we have to look at how the history played out. Mm-hmm. Right? Actions speak louder than words, always. And we have to look at the actions of these figures to understand what they meant by the words that they said. And even if the new capital is Rome and you have this Davidic kingship reestablished at Rome, the Christian emperors were almost entirely in Constantinople. So I think that at least when I hear your argument, and I hear that logic, the way I could just see it going straight to Constantinople. And
yeah, good. So I think in the paper that I sent you, in the paper that I had published in Haythrop, I also mentioned like someone might want to say the conversion of Constantine and all the work that he did was the moment when the Messiah conquered Rome, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd say, yeah, that seems to fit the bill, so to speak, right? But then I'd also want to add in, though, with the reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy, one of the distinct ways to identify it is if you could identify who the prime minister was, because the prime minister could rule in the place of the king. He could, he would put his seal upon all the official documents. He would be deputized to make rulings on his behalf, as I stated before. And, this was a singular position of the prime minister who could represent the king, right? So then I would say, let's do both, right? Let's do both Constantine and Peter being the new Eliakim and his successors being the new prime ministers of old Rome, right? So to speak. So then I guess like we kind of hit a standstill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So then maybe the last thing that we should talk about then is how do we break a standstill? Because it seems as if like you acknowledge that this interpretation I have seems valid. I acknowledge that the interpretation you have also seems valid, right? So how would we break this standstill that we have between us, so to speak?
Well, can I ask you some questions after we answer this one?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to take up all your time. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I have plenty of time today. It's all yours, Suan. So the answer, we have to look at history. We have to look at the Church of the Ecumenical Councils and see how the saints themselves handled the situation. It's one thing to have this glorious idea of how it should have been, but we have to look at the facts on the ground. We have to look at the canons themselves. We have to look at the writings of the saints, and that's how we can break that standstill. And I've noticed that in recent years in the Catholic Church, there's been a tremendous movement away from the type of apologetics that people like Eric Ibarra do, where they say, okay, you here, Dom Chapman, Adrian Fortescue, Giles, right here. It was from the very beginning, Vatican I, Satis Cognitum, it's all here. And it's been more of this sort of like unveiling over the centuries. And that, I think, poses just as many problems as the previous hermeneutic that was used. And the reason is, as far as I can tell, in the East, we're not budging.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, keep in mind, we are the main possessors of a church that has had a ladder stuck above a doorpost for 150 some years. And no one dares move this thing. And people are just fine with that. It's a Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so it's the ladder. People are just fine with it. Like, wait another 100 years, whatever, it's fine. So I don't really see a way out of it. Honestly, as far as church reunion, I really do not see a way out of it. I think that the schism will just continue until the end of time. I think there will be attempts at reunion, but with the waning of belief in the West, which is very unfortunate, as I mentioned in our previous conversation, I think that you're going to see more and more push to simply start a patriarch in the West. And if that is ever started, then there's essentially no chance at healing it. It's then you have parallel hierarchies, and it's which already now you have parallel hierarchies. You just don't have a pope per se. You have one, I think it's a Romanian bishop who's a current bishop of Rome, but he doesn't have like a patriarchal status. And I think the only thing that has held that back has been a power grab by Constantinople, who does not want to lose their position as number one. I think that's it. That's the only thing that's held it back. You had mentioned something about, I'm trying to think, you mentioned something earlier I want to get back to. Anyway, that was that. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, so to keep on kind of maybe doing one last point on the Davidic kingdom, right?
Please.
I mentioned before that we shouldn't unnecessarily weaken our apologetic for our Jewish brothers and sisters, right? And especially in the first century, what they were expecting was the resurrection of the Davidic monarchy itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you consider it a strength of the Catholic position that it takes the Davidic covenant and rebuilding of the monarchy so seriously, right? That it believes that there's a prime minister who endures in the same singular fashion as had been in the case in the Old Testament?
Well, first I would say the people who thought there was going to be this like reestablished Davidic kingship, those were the same people who crucified Jesus. So I don't really know if I want to take them very seriously. The people who thought that there was going to be this reestablished Davidic kingship, and then who were, sort of realizing like, okay, wait, this Jesus figure is not reestablishing Israel as a separate secular entity. He seems perfectly fine with the Romans. He says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. those people are then like, okay, this is more of a religious movement, and they're corrected. One of the great disappointments in Jesus was the fact that, where are the swords? He goes, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. One of the great, you could say, breaking points between Judaism and Christianity was the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Simon Bar Kokhba claims to be the Messiah. He tries to start a secular state, and the Christians are like, dude, this is like the final straw. We're totally separate. The first Jewish rebellion was a big enough break, where they tried to establish an actual kingdom, and the Christians are just like, hello? Like, no. My kingdom is not of this earth. So, in that sense, I don't know if the Catholic Church was actually thinking that when they attempted to create this whole thing with a prime minister, and as you said, I think in order to actually fulfill Isaiah 22, you would have to have a high priestly figure who is administering both the secular state and the religious state. You'd have to have a theocracy. So I would not say that the papacy fulfills Isaiah 22 in any way, even in that shape.
Yeah, good. So I think was it N.T. Wright, another good scholar that I think we both respect. He kind of made the argument that, yeah, it seems like Jesus basically came to establish a theocracy, although it looks as if that theocracy won't be totally achieved until the eschaton. But
yeah,
there's some
Christ is king. Yeah.
Right. This goes into the other question too about like how we view the eschaton, because I would say in a very real sense Christ is king right now, right?
Of course.
In a very real sense the Davidic monarchy is alive again, right? Although it's not going to reach its complete or fullness, right? All it was meant to be, that final theocracy, until the eschaton. But that doesn't mean that the seed wasn't planted now. Just as, for instance, Paul says that we're now new creations, although we know that ultimately speaking, there is going to be a new Jerusalem. There's going to be a new earth and a new heaven, right? There are bits of the new right now that are building up to the old. So then I would get around that objection about, well, we don't have a theocracy now, by saying, yeah, but we're building up to it, right? And right now, and this is kind of part of my own work in papal theology, but the reason why I view the papacy as aesthetically pleasing, or at least theologically beautiful, right, is because I think it is the eschatological kingdom manifested now, allowing us to participate in the Davidic kingship of Christ now, and then preparing us for when we will rule the cosmos with Christ in the end times, right? So the point I'm making here is that that's how I get around the objection that you just raised about Isaiah is not fulfilled yet because we don't have a theocracy. I'm saying we're building up to it, right? But there's that. So the other thing I wanted to say too was that, you're right that the same people who wanted this, well, not all of them, but some of them did say that they wanted Jesus. They crucified Jesus, right? Some of the same people who wanted this Davidic kingdom. But in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, even some of the disciples, they asked Jesus, are you now going to restore the kingdom of Israel? And then Jesus says, it's not time for you to know. And then he ascends into heaven, right? Right. Which is not saying that he's not going to do it, but he's just saying it's not time for you to know yet, right? Right. But so what I'd want to say here, right, is that even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I don't see any reason why not we take them right in this particular circumstance. For instance, Caiaphas in John 11:51-52, he's the high priest of Israel. He's part of the Sanhedrin that kills Jesus, right? Although we can get into a conversation about how that Sanhedrin was technically invalid under rabbinic law and hence wasn't a true counterexample of the authority of the Sanhedrin. But anyway, Caiaphas in John 11:51-52 still receives prophecy from God that Jesus will die for the children of that Jesus will die for the sins of the world and reunite the children of Israel. So even these broken clocks can still be right twice a day. So I'm saying, why not take it? Like, I see no reason why not we take them as literally as we can in this capacity.
Because Jesus states that he's not reestablishing the kingdom of Israel when he tells people, or he's not establishing the secular arm of it, not at this time. I mean, I think your best argument is the seed, right?
Yeah.
So I would not, I'd say your best argument is there's a seed, but then you'd have to prove exactly, I mean, why do you have a prime minister for a kingdom that doesn't exist yet?
I mean, well, it does exist, right? I mean,
why have a prime minister on Earth for a kingdom that is not, you could say, present on Earth yet? Wouldn't you have to have the king like actually present and administering affairs on Earth to have that prime minister be a valid prime minister? I mean, that's how I think.
Right, but like as you know, under the Davidic monarchy, when the king was not immediately on the throne, the prime minister would become the regent of the kingdom. He would become the king, in effect, on the earth. And then we know in John's gospel that Jesus says before he ascends, or before he ascends and leaves, he says, "It is better that I should leave you," right? So Jesus, in some sense, is saying he left when he ascended, but he's saying it's better for us because then that's when the history of the church really begins, and that's when I would say the prime ministerial office kicks into full force.
So is the Pope handling secular affairs?
Well, and then I would reiterate the previous answer that I gave, which is that we're building up to that eventually in the theocracy that is to come. But right now we kind of have, and even I wanted to say too that in the Bible, in the scriptures, the kingdom of God is described as a seed, right, that has been planted. So that's why when I use that analogy, it's not me kind of inventing it for my own ad hoc convenience. And then even Jesus, when he says, for instance, the kingdom of God is within your midst. The Greek there is entos himen. The what was it? The IVP Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. It's saying there that it's not. He's not saying within your heart. He's not saying this kind of wishy-washy, phrase. He's saying in your midst. Like it's not necessarily something you can physically grasp, but it's present now. It's here now, right? And then even Jesus says the kingdom of God has come to those who are freed of demons. And even in the Old Testament, right, God is described as the King of Israel, and then yet we see this messianic figure being described as one day being the final King of Israel, right? So what I'm saying is that in the scriptures, you see this theme of contrast between what is now here and what is yet to come. And both are relevant, but what is here now is pointing and reflecting in a dimmer sense what is yet to come.
So what is a patristic commentary on all of that?
Right. So then when it comes to the patristics, you cited, for instance, some of the Syriac fathers, at least mentioning that the Isaiah 22:22 parallel. You could probably go...
I don't mean about that specifically. I mean about what you just said.
About the new Israel.
Yeah, about the new Israel being established. I mean, how do the church fathers look at that?
Right. So then, for instance, let's see here. I mentioned Justin Martyr talking to Trypho about us being the new Israel in a way, right? And being, Paul talks about us being grafted into the tree. In terms of the reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy, I'm not sure if I can cite a father off the top of my head at the moment. Although what I'd also say is that we already have enough of the deposit of scripture and the first century Jewish sources to know that that was how it was meant to play out already, right? So if the fathers don't comment on it, that isn't necessarily a problem. And I would argue, right, at least as a Catholic, what I would argue is that history providentially manifested the Davidic kingship, even if the fathers didn't mention it, right? Because it's God who's navigating and controlling this kingdom and bringing it to fruition. So I would say that it providentially came to its climax at Vatican I.
Okay, so that it just sort of grew over time, because it's, as far as I know, nowhere in the patristic sources is it mentioned that Rome is some sort of Davidic monarchy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair point to make. And then I think this kind of goes back to my point on originalism too, because I think when it comes to originalism as such, and I originally was going to study constitutional law before I got into this beautiful study of the scriptures. You know, I think you're right that with the early interpretation, the earliest interpretations don't necessarily spill out this great kind of Petrine supreme, whatever you want to call it, right? And I think you're right that, or at least I appreciate it when you acknowledge that in the previous interview, and even this one, I think, like you're going to have to take a doctrinal development view, but you have to do it in a way that does not come off ad hoc and you know, too preloaded, so to speak, with too many controversial assumptions, right?
Right.
And what I would say is that I don't think this idea of the literal reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy is a controversial presupposition. It's something that a first century Jew would have expected. And it just so happens providentially that that's how history came to be manifested. So for instance, like in my opening statement, and stop me if I'm blabbering too much, but yeah, stop me if I'm blabbering too much. Yeah. In my opening statement, you know, for instance, I mentioned in originalism, like authorial intent, right? So in Matthew's gospel, we know that Matthew was clearly obsessed with portraying Jesus as the son of David. One of the reasons that we know this is that he goes so far as to basically kind of fudge Jesus's genealogy a little bit. So, you know, we obviously know that Matthew and Luke's genealogies conflict, and any harmonization that's been conducted it doesn't really work, right? There's a lot of issues that come up, and there have been a lot of attempts to try to resolve it, right? But one of the approaches that I find most promising is from the work of Michael Licona. And what he points out is that the reason why Matthew kind of fudges with Jesus's genealogy is because Matthew explicitly says, you know, here are 3 sets of 14 generations, right? And then when you look at this Hebraic code that was used, right, to translate consonants into numbers, David's number without the vowels would be DVD, the numbers would be 14, right? The 14 was the number of David. And then in the New Testament, Matthew uses 3 sets of 14 generations, you know, to the point of almost fudging with Jesus's genealogy just to make it so clear and emphatic that Jesus is the son of David, or Jesus is the new David, right? So I think authorial intent there, I think Matthew intends to show Jesus as a Davidic monarch in a very real sense, fulfilling the covenant. And then Luke, you know, beautifully fulfills that and fills that out in Luke chapter 1. The surrounding first century culture, obviously we have the Jewish sources talking about the reconstruction of the Davidic monarchy, the hopes of the people about that, Jewish theology and traditions. The only place where you got me, so to speak, and I don't mean that in a rude way, the real place where I think you get me, or got me, excuse me, is in terms of the early reception. It seems as if, like, between the, as you pointed out, the Bar Kokhba revolt, there was kind of even during the writing of the Gospel of John, even, there was kind of a reduction of the Jewish consciousness of Christianity, although it was still clearly present, right, in the 2nd century. Although it seems as if, like, you know, clearly over time the Jews and the Christians had a much tougher relationship with each other, and eventually kind of identified themselves as 2 separate groups. So then I would say that I would explain the lack of the fathers saying this with the historic split between Judaism and Christianity, and that this split, although it's part of our history, it was not present at least in the 1st century within the writing of the first Gospels and the earliest theologies.
Okay.
And that's what's really, I think, important. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I have a few questions for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Go ahead. I've been talking too much.
Oh, sorry. No, quite all right. It's been lovely. You have a very nice voice. Oh, now I have to compliment Lewis's voice, or he'll get jealous. Lewis, you have a nice voice too. No, I'm just teasing. So are you aware of what the typical understanding of the keys is in patristic texts?
Well, okay, so I'm going off of your witness, right? And your witness seems to be that the keys tend to be, well, I mean, even in the Jewish sources, right? The keys represent, if we're not talking about the original Davidic monarchical context, the keys of the temple, the keys of the priest.
Okay, so in the Church Fathers, the general understanding of the keys is to bind and to loose sins, right? It has very little, I mean, almost never does it actually have anything to do with legislation about teachings. And there's a quotation here I have from the Catholic Encyclopedia. I believe it's a 1917 one. It's the one that's up at EWTN. The writer states, "It is comparatively seldom that the Fathers, when speaking of the power of the keys, make any reference to the supremacy of Peter. When they deal with the question, they ordinarily appeal not to the gift of the keys, but to the office as the rock on which the Church is founded. And their references to the potestas clavium, they are usually intent on vindicating against the Montanist and Novationist heretics the power inherent in the Church to forgive," right? Now, it also states very interestingly, it says, "The meaning attached to the term by the older scholastics was, however, very different from this," talking about forgiveness of sins. Because they followed the patristic tradition and confined the significance of the keys to the judicial authority exercised in the sacrament of penance. Okay, so right now, something I'm compiling with some friends, and this thing is going to be absolutely gigantic. It will put you to sleep. It's that long and tedious. I mean, if you struggle from insomnia, you're going to want to read this one. Is how the Church Fathers saw the power of the keys. And so far, we notice that there's a separation, right? So there's how they see the keys given to Peter, and then the keys present in Matthew 3:7. Okay, now the general patristic understanding of the keys in Matthew 3:7 is that it's a right to allow someone into heaven or to bar them from heaven. Okay, in Matthew, how they take the keys in Matthew 16:17 through 19 has much more to do about the forgiveness of sins. It's the binding and the loosing, okay? There is one statement that I'm aware of by Pope St. Gregory the Great where he might be implying that has something to do about administration of the church or care for the church. Then again, part of caring for the church has to do with the forgiveness of sins, has to do with penance. That's a big, big thing in the church. So I was wondering, how do you reconcile the view of the Church Fathers about what the keys are with the views of the Protestant scholars and the rabbis you've quoted from?
Yeah, good. I think this is like the preeminent question. And I even saw in the chat not too long ago, someone was asking about, well, why does Swan's, Christ gives the power to bind and loose to the apostles in 18:18 and not just Peter in 16:19. So I think that this is a question that should be addressed, and we can talk about the patristics as well. And then obviously like the patristics, that's like your area of expertise. I told you before, I only kept myself to the first century and that which is within living memory. So, like I only have the first 3 volumes. So it's of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. So my research will be somewhat limited in this capacity, but I can answer still.
Those are some good volumes to have.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when it comes to binding and loosing in the keys, I think one important thing to point out is that one can have the power to bind and loose without having the keys in the first place. So for instance, so then this gets into an interesting question. So this is the argument that I'd make, right? The argument that I would make is that if the keys represent this prime ministerial authority, right, and the power to open and shut. Now, someone might want to say, also, can you hear my cat right now? Like he's kind of at my door. Can you hear him?
Yeah, he's fine. I like cats, so I don't mind.
Okay, yeah. Because he's at my door right now. So let me get to him real quick.
Yeah, no problem. I'm gonna grab a glass of water real quickly.
Sure. Sorry.
So no problem.
Yeah, this is pretty awesome, Ubi. During our debate, my cat just crashes it.
Okay, all right, I'm back.
Okay, yeah, my cat's in my room now. Hopefully it doesn't cause havoc. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the point that I was going to make is that it seems to me that one can have the power to bind and loose without having the keys. And
Mhm.
the reason why I say that is because if the keys represent this prime ministerial power, binding and loosing by the time of Jesus was, already this like independent idea, right? That this was the power of the rabbis to interpret the law and to also execute judicial decisions. So they could excommunicate, they could forgive sins, they could return people to the community or return them to temple life. But then again, the power to bind and loose and the power to open and shut, they are similar enough to preserve the typology between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19, but they are not literal, or they're not, how do I put it? Binding and loosing is similar enough so that in Matthew 16:19, with the keys, you can identify 16:19 as a typological parallel of Isaiah 22:22. But in Matthew 18:18, they don't need to entail the keys because binding and loosing already was this independent Second Temple rabbinic idea or power that would have been understood without reference or need for the keys. That would be the way that I would distinguish by saying what makes Peter unique is the keys and not necessarily his binding and loosing power. Although I would say in Acts chapter 5, Peter's binding and loosing power is dramatically and immediately endorsed by God in a way unlike what we see any other apostle receive in the scriptures. When it comes to the fathers not necessarily respond, or the fathers, right, and what they say. I mean, one thing to point out is that, oftentimes Protestants will bring up to me that, well, Swan, you say that Matthew 16:18 clearly says Peter's the rock, but then the patristics seem divided or split on the issue, or they'll say the rock is Jesus or the rock is this or that, right? I mean, the way that you get around that objection is by pointing out that within the first century, the belief of the Jews, even in the Qumran community, was that Abraham was the rock on which God built old Israel. So aside from, for instance, the Yalkut Shimoni or the Avraham Petra Midrash in the 13th century, which scholars use to go back to the first century, they'll also mention the fact that in the Thanksgiving hymn in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it describes on how Israel is built on this rock, right? And then in Isaiah 51:1-2, I believe, Abraham is identified as the rock on which Israel is built. So the point here then is that in order to get around some of the conflict in the patristics, the best way to do it is to go behind the patristics, so to speak, into the Jewish roots of the faith, which are already in its DNA and composition, regardless of whether or not the fathers pick up on it or not explicitly. And so that would be the argument that I'd use for the keys. And then I offered you the reasons before about distinguishing Peter's status. So you remember when I said in the Old Testament, Eliakim, even if he's a priest like all the other priests, or he's a high priest like all the other high priests, what makes him unique is that he has this administrative power that is second to the king. I would say the same with Peter in the New Testament. So yeah, all the apostles have the power to bind and loose. Peter has the power to bind and loose, but Peter uniquely has the keys. And then I'd offer the arguments once again. So that's how I respond.
Okay. So you had said something about going sort of behind the patristics back to the Jewish roots. Now, you're aware that many of the early church fathers were converts from Judaism.
Yeah, that's correct.
Like, for example, Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, he wrote the work on heresies. He was a heresy hunter. And then there's the Syriac tradition, which itself is heavily influenced by Judaism. Wouldn't you think that those church fathers who are converting in from Judaism would be aware of this Jewish teaching you're talking about and would therefore bring light on it?
Right.
I mean, conversion to Christianity.
Yeah. Good. So I mean, then this gets into the argument from silence, right? Because the thing is, even if they don't mention it, independent of whether or not they mentioned it, right? These sources are there, and these sources are publicly available for us throughout history to have used them and interpreted them, right? So whether or not a specific father brings that up, I mean,
there are all sorts of questions that you can ask yourself about why doesn't the father bring up this or that. For instance, to use kind of an anachronistic example, this is not like perfectly what you're talking about, but I'll get to it. Like St. Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on Matthew, he says that Peter is made into like a new Eliakim, so he recognizes the Isaiah 22:22 parallel. But then Aquinas says that Christ is the rock of Matthew 16:18.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why he's doing that is because he's been influenced by a great deal by Augustine, right? And he cites him extensively. So then sometimes for some of the fathers, it's possible that what they're doing is they're reiterating what they heard other fathers say, what they heard their tradition say. They felt no need to necessarily question it, right? So then there wasn't that need to go look at the parallel, or that there wasn't that need to, for instance, recite whatever the Jewish traditions were. And as you and I both know, with the Bar Kokhba revolt, or even at the end of the 1st century, or the conflicts between the Judaizers and the Christians in the early church, there were already social and ethnic conflicts between the Jews and the Gentile Christians. So it seems not highly improbable to me that there are other reasons for why these traditions aren't mentioned explicitly by the fathers, rather than it simply being the case that they have no relevance to the theology at hand.
Right, because a lot of these church fathers, they do go into detail about what the keys mean. A lot of these converts from Judaism, they go into detail about what the keys mean. You'd think that would be a perfect opportunity to mention, oh, by the way, and instead they just go with the general patristic witness. And I do think I want to bring it back to something I think is interesting. That is that the church fathers in general who comment on Revelation, which are not a lot of them, because that book was not read liturgically in the East until, I don't think it still is even read liturgically. I think there might be one time a year we actually use it, but it was not included in the canon of many church fathers. So very few commented on it. But those that do comment, they seem to see a different key being given to Peter versus one that Christ holds in Revelation 3:7. And so most of the church fathers I'm aware of, when they comment on the key in Revelation, they actually look at it in terms of enlightenment, of understanding difficult scriptural passages, or they'll look at it perhaps opening and shutting the gates of Hades, right? And that point there kind of is, you could see the connection between forgiveness of sins and whatnot. But as far as Matthew 16:17 goes, almost universally. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and actually just say universally. I'm going to do it. Don't try and stop me. I'm doing it. They say binding and loosing is the power of the keys, to the point that you have like St. John Chrysostom saying all the keys were given to all of the apostles. And that can also get back into what we were talking about earlier with Robert Bellarmine, the Roman Catholic Saint Robert Bellarmine, stating that Peter ordained all of the apostles. Well, if he ordained all the apostles, and all the apostles get the gift of the keys.
Yeah, so then
he passes that on.
Sure. So one course of response on my end would be perhaps maybe to concede, right, that even if all the apostles have this power of binding and loosing, or excuse me, they all have in some way possess the keys, right, which is the patristic witness. They all possess the keys in some sense, even the bishops, right? One thing I would say is that, but also Peter is the only one that seems to have seems to have those two unique connections to Eliakim, right? So that even if everyone possesses the keys as the rabbis did, what still makes Peter unique is that he is like Eliakim, the one given the unique administrative authority to be second in command to the king. So that you can say, yeah, they all have the keys, but he's the one who has the office of prime minister uniquely, because Peter is the one who's likened to a rock, Eliakim is likened to a peg, and then second, Eliakim appears first on the list of the king's officials. Peter, likewise, in every single list of the apostles appears first, and Matthew goes to the extent of calling him protos, right? So that I'd say, okay, sure, I'll grant what you're saying, but I'll say even then I can still accept that interpretation and still come out with, the papal supremacist view that I have, if you will. So what I'll say is, yeah, that's valid, but so is my interpretation valid, right? So
I have another question, if you don't mind.
Right,
Going
yeah.
back to Saint Cyril of Alexandria, the main, I would say, probably the main exegete in the, well, Saint John Chrysostom as well, probably the main exegete, but Saint Cyril is one of the top ones. He identifies Eliakim with Christ.
Right.
What would you say to that? How would you respond to that? Because I mean, there's hardly any patristic commentary on Isaiah 22. Like, I just spent like a week searching for it. Like, there's basically two quotations.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
states he was a high priest. The other states it's Jesus Christ. Why would you say Saint Cyril is wrong?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of Saint Cyril being wrong, or for instance, D.A. Carson in his 1984 Expositor's Bible Commentary points out that with typology, types needn't necessarily always be exclusive to one person, right? So it's possible, depending on the context, that you could have multiple types referring to, or one type referring to multiple persons, although with respect to the context, something about that particular person is being highlighted, right? So for instance, like, a lot of Protestants want to say, well, no, Jesus is the rock of Matthew 16:18. Well, we could say, well, one, for instance, and let's say like Jesus is the cornerstone. That's what Paul calls him, right? But then, once somebody else could say, well, no, Ephesians 2:20 says the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, right? So then, no, the foundation is the prophets and the apostles. And the idea here is that you could have a type or an image refer to multiple persons, right? And that's not unheard of in typology. And there are various other examples of this. So for instance, a lot of Jews would say, well, when it's talking about the son of David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, it seems to be more talking about Solomon, right? And then I could say, well, yeah, I can talk about Solomon too. And Solomon can be a type for Jesus as well, just as King David can be a type for Jesus, whatever, so on and so forth. So my point here is that it's not a matter of St. Cyril being wrong. It's a matter of the fact that typologies can be applied to multiple persons, and we see this commonly in the text of Scripture, or even in Jewish works. So yeah, I mean, I would just say that the application and what you derive from the connection is dependent on the context.
So wouldn't you think, though, that Saint Cyril of Alexandria, he's in an actual Petrine see, right? I mean, he's a guy who's tremendously nuanced. This is a fellow who rips Nestorius to shreds. His entire theology is the foundation for Ephesus, Chalcedon, Second Constantinople, and even, well, actually every ecumenical council after that. I mean, don't you think it's suspicious that he just leaves out any comparison to Peter, that he just goes, oh, it's Christ, and then moves on?
Well, I mean, I think on one hand, it can strike us as kind of odd that someone wouldn't mention, a parallel like that. But then there's also a question on how much you actually want to load into the argument from silence, right? Because historically speaking, and the philosopher Timothy McGrew has a good paper on the argument from silence where he discusses there are plenty of examples throughout history in which a source that would seem to have every reason to mention something does not. So for instance, in Thucydides' work, I think it's his history, right? He covers the history of Athens, and he covers this 20-year period in which Socrates was active and alive, and where he's eventually killed. And Thucydides doesn't mention Socrates at all, which is really odd, because Socrates is one of the greatest philosophers, one of the most controversial figures of Athens, and he goes unmentioned in the history of Thucydides. Or even Acts, right? So
there's a reason for that, though, if you don't mind, may I say?
Oh, sure. If there's a reason, then I'd like to no longer use that example. So please tell me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. By the way, Thucydides' work, to the audience, Thucydides' work is absolutely fantastic. If you're looking for some ancient literature to read, it is really, really good. Along with the March of Xenophon, that is excellent as well. Someone needs to make a movie out of the March of Xenophon. Anyway, the reason is that Socrates himself was put to death by the state for corrupting the youth of Athens. So he was basically an embarrassment.
Okay, good. So that, yeah, that's
Sorry,
good clarification.
continue.
Yeah. I mean, so if you look at the McGrew paper, there are other examples, but I mean, there's one biblical example that I think is worth mentioning, right? So for instance, in Acts, there's a question on when Acts was written. Acts and Luke were originally one volume. That seems to be the consensus of scholars. Luke seems to come after Matthew, and then, Matthew is a perfection of Mark. Mark was written maybe 30 years after the death of Jesus, so we're in the 60s now. And then Matthew was written maybe 10 years later, so 70s or early, or maybe after. Usually they say after the temple was destroyed. So then if Luke is writing and he writes also Acts does not mention the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, right? And this is like the history of the early church. This is the text in which we get the martyrdom of, I believe it's Stephen, right? We get the martyrdom of multiple people. We get all the persecution and trials. Why wouldn't Luke mention the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, the pivotal apostles of the early church, so to speak, right? It seems to me that this is also a potential argument from silence. So, I mean, one thing you could posit is maybe like Luke didn't want to mention this really painful memory of the death of Peter and Paul. And then even Clement talks about it, right? Obviously in his letter. So maybe Luke didn't feel obliged to mention it because he knew his audience already knew about it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so there are a host of reasons that I think we could offer for why we think an author should mention something, but they don't. And also, it doesn't change. Could I just say one thing real quick, and I'll let you talk?
First,
yeah, I just wanted to say too. I just wanted to say too that even if the author doesn't mention the typology between Peter and Eliakim in the way that I've specified, I've offered independent reasons why I think that interpretation stands as public evidence accessible to anyone who wants to study or look into the Jewish roots of the faith. So if the fathers don't mention it, then they just don't mention it. That doesn't take away from its existence.
Right. As to why Acts does not mention the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul,
post 60s. Mm-hmm.
Right. Is that, from what I've read, most likely it seems to be that the author of Luke Acts was actually planning a trilogy. He did not. He stops at it because he stops it at this very awkward point, in the same way that he stops the Gospel of Luke in this awkward point. And it seems to be that he's setting up for a third session. That's what I've read, and that could be an answer, but I mean, it's all speculation, right?
What's the source on that? I'm just interested.
I probably read it 10 or 15 years ago.
That's okay.
If you remind me in chat, and I will try my hardest to look it up and find it for you, because I've read it in multiple places that Luke Acts was parts 1 and 2 of a trilogy.
That sounds good.
I appreciate your answer there. I mean, to me at least, when I look at a situation like Saint Cyril leaving out the fact that Eliakim is this precursor to Peter, I think, well, okay, Saint Cyril sits on the second see in Chrysostom. It's a Petrine see. Mentioning Eliakim as Peter would only strengthen his position, especially because he goes through great lengths to get Rome on his side against Nestorius. And I mean, for us in the East, we look for the patristic consensus on things. And so if there is not a patristic consensus, that doesn't mean that it's wrong per se, but it is very, very suspect. I mean, extremely so. To the point that, that's another, I don't want to bring up COVID. The comment section will just explode all of a sudden. But the guys, please do not comment on COVID in the comment section, please. Let's keep this on task. But no, these things are seen as very suspect if they don't mention that. And so it's like, okay, in the Catholic Church, you have 1,000 years where there's essentially, a handful of comments about Peter possessing the keys. There's a handful of comments that could indicate Peter possessing the keys in a unique way, and they almost all come from popes who are in sort of crisis situations where they're trying to defend themselves. And then you have tons and tons and tons of commentary about the keys being possessed by all pastors, about the keys being binding and loosing, about all pastors having binding and loosing. In fact, most of the commentary I was able to find on, for example, John 21:15 through 19, it puts it straight out as, it applies to pastors, right? I mean,
Right, yeah.
and a lot of the commentary I was able to find on Matthew 16:17 through 19, I believe, it also applies it onto pastors. So that's just my suspicions there. Do you have any other questions, or do you want to start taking questions from the audience?
Well, I mean, so let me ask this one question, then we can move on, perhaps. Hey, Lewis, what's up? It's already dark there. Sorry.
Been a while.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know if you guys want to do questions from the audience, I can. Maybe you guys just like do one more question for each other each,
Sure.
and then 5-minute closing statements, and then we can do Q&A for, I don't know, until we get, maybe I'll probably get sick of it before you guys do. So.
Yeah. Be our filter of the questions. Okay, so Ubi, let me ask you one question, then you ask me one question. How about that?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there's a point that I want to mention, though, which is I think it's admirable, actually. It's very respectable that you look at the fathers, right, and especially their consensus. That's actually something very Jewish, by the way, because the Jews have this idea of Razal or Hazal or Shazal, the consensus of the sages or the fathers in their faith. So I just thought that'd be nice to point out. But
Well, thank you. Well, I like bagels, so it fits.
What'd you say?
I love bagels and lox, so I love bagels and lox, so I'm not surprised that I have Jewish tendencies.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Okay. Anyway, so I wanted to ask, well, I made a point earlier about how the fathers are subject, however, to historical contingencies. And we would, like there are times where you'd expect a source would mention X, Y, and Z, and they don't for whatever reason that we can't fathom or we can only imagine, right? Given, as you mentioned, with the Bar Kokhba revolt and the early kind of conflicts between Jews and Christians, and even the fact, I don't know how many of the fathers really stress, I mean, so this is something you can illumine me on, how many fathers really stress the Davidic kingdom or the Davidic kingship of Christ or that sort of thing. It seems to me that even if we value the consensus of the fathers, it seems to me that if we're looking at this from like a strictly historical, or at least a historical standpoint, right, we would care at least about the fathers who are earliest, and then the fathers that come later, we judge them we judge their interpretations, or we listen to them, especially when they're in their ecumenical councils. And we also have to acknowledge then that the fathers are also subject to historical contingencies and other factors that we aren't aware of. So my question is, I mean, even if an interpretation doesn't have the consensus of the fathers, don't you think it's still possible that one could overcome the suspicion that one has if the consensus isn't there?
Well, we would first have to accept that somehow we know more than them, that we're more spiritually enlightened than them. And I mean, we're not talking about half a dozen people commenting on the Bible. We're talking about thousands. We're talking about people who would spend hours and hours per day reading the Bible, people who more often than not had the entire Psalter memorized. So, I mean, that's a pretty tall order for us to say that we're more enlightened than them in that respect. And I think it's honestly dangerous to say that. Because there are a lot of things that you could say, well, we know more than the church fathers. It's here in the Bible. I mean, that was more or less Arius's line, right? I mean, he pulls up a lot of verses, him and Eunomius. I'm not saying that you're like Arius. I'm not. Please don't take it that way. But that was, that was their line. So it's here in the Bible. Look at this verse in Proverbs. Oh, look at this. Look at that. I mean, you can really end up way the heck out there if you do not anchor yourself down with patristic commentary. And it's part of obedience in the Christian church, that you listen
Right,
to
yeah.
those who know more, you're in obedience to those who know more. And this need to go back into the fathers to justify something is something that as Catholics and Orthodox we have in common. The emphasis that Vatican I places on trying to prove papal infallibility from patristic texts, or I should say rather later, prior and later Catholic scholars and bishops go on trying to prove Vatican I from patristic texts, is a demonstration of that. At the same time, I mean, you have figures like Bishop Vincent Gasser, who in his Relatio just throws his hands up and goes, well, there's really no instances of it. There's just instances that people believed it could have happened, right? So that is my answer there.
All right. I'll let you now ask your question.
Just a quick question. Could you hold your cat up? What does your cat look like? Is he still there?
No, he left the room. I can go get him if you want me to. I can fetch him.
Oh, it's all right. What does he look like? What kind of cat is he?
He's a short hair, kind of. He's white and kind of this nice tan color. Well, how about you ask your question as we transition to Q&A? I'll go get him. Yeah.
Oh, please. I'd love to. I love cats. I love cats.
Yeah.
He sounds lovely. All right. So my question I would say thank you so much for coming on and spending your time with us today. My question would be, what would it take for you to accept the Orthodox position on ecclesiology?
Good. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, so it's going to depend on Israelology, right? So if, for example, we have something in the New Testament that implies a much lower Israelology, one that it doesn't take the Davidic kingdom as literally being resurrected and manifested once again, it would have to do something with the nature of the new Israel and the nature of Christ's messianic kingdom. So if you could point out, for instance, well, no, I mean, the Jewish sources also believed that the office of prime minister was going to be eventually thrown out, right, when the Messiah would come. Or the Messiah, there's a Jewish source that says, oh, the Messiah is not going to bring in the prime minister, right? I might be like, oh, okay. Or things like that. I mean, at most, the Jewish sources talk about, Uriah Kaplan in his book on the Handbook of Jewish Thought. They talk about how, like, the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin would be restored into a new Sanhedrin. So potentially, if you say, I think the strongest point you made, Ubi, was that if the church is modeled in a very strict sense after the Sanhedrin, then that actually could only get us an honorific high priest or Nasi, right? Although you could try and make the Nasi of Nasi arguments that I did, but then you could come up with your objection. So then I think the primary argument is going to be, what kind of kingdom did Christ bring on the earth that will ultimately be fulfilled and completed in the eschaton? That would shape my view on the issue. Yeah.
Okay. And in that view, and this is sort of tied in with that, in forming that view, and I don't mean to be insulting by asking this, you trust post-Christian rabbinic sources and Protestant scholars, old church scholars. Am I correct?
Well, as I pointed out, when you have arguments from silence, right, there are all sorts of reasons why someone might not mention a particular interpretation. So what I would say is, for instance, as you asked before, like, I'm not saying that St. Cyril of Alexandria is wrong. I'm just saying he didn't mention it, or they didn't point it out, right? But that independent of that, that doesn't take away the fact that it's there. And the fathers have an incredible reputation and they're incredibly important. But I also wonder too, what justifies the assumption, other than a good piety, which I think is respectable, that they would mention everything, right, that was done right from the start, right? I think it's possible that there were things that they didn't necessarily mention that we can find in the ancient Jewish sources. And as you pointed out, and as I'll reiterate, Jews and Christians had conflicts with one another. which would make sense of why perhaps, for instance, certain Jewish things aren't mentioned anymore to a predominantly Gentile church. Or even, for instance, Oss in his book, he makes the argument with respect to these Jewish traditions on Peter being seated on the throne of Moses and these other things that, with the conflict and the rise of a Gentile church, a lot of Jewish things could be lost in the process. Or even, for instance, like some of the work that I've been doing to answer Protestantism, I've been doing work on the Jewish ordination rite of Seneca and how it models after apostolic succession. Irenaeus, when he defends the doctrine of apostolic succession, he mentions, the witness of the apostles, how they would pass on to their successors their knowledge, right? But he doesn't mention the fact that in the first century, among the Pharisees, during the time of Jesus, and even before, right, you would have to, in order to have a valid ministry, be able to trace your ordination through Joshua and to Moses. That's pretty significant in order to make the case that this is not just Irenaeus making a cultural or intellectual or kind of, reputational argument, right? Irenaeus is making an argument from the first century Jewish sources such that it is an authentic first century teaching that more than likely came from either the apostles or Christ himself. So what I'm saying here is that on one hand, the Jewish sources that go unmentioned, Ubi, they strengthen our faith. They strengthen the doctrine of apostolic succession. They strengthen the model of our church, the parts of the ecclesiology that we agree on. And what I'm saying here is that, okay, if you follow those Jewish sources, then you also get this other view, right? That the Davidic monarchy is going to be very literally rebuilt. And then what I say is, well, if the fathers don't mention it, just like Irenaeus doesn't mention it, but he depends upon it in some way, or even if they don't mention it, but Jesus is independent of that, the Messiah, the new Moses, the new David, the new Adam, then it's there. And why wouldn't I use that to strengthen my apologetic? Why wouldn't I take that as evidence, even if the fathers don't say it? I'm not saying that I'm smarter than them. I'm just saying that they didn't mention it, and we don't know why. But we have the evidence there for us to access and look at. And it's totally compatible, and it's totally orthodox with respect to the identity of Christ. It magnifies our Lord. It magnifies his legitimacy even to our Jewish brothers and sisters, even 2,000 years ago, that no, you really did crucify your Messiah. You really did crucify the one that was going to bring the Davidic kingdom, right? So I would see no reason why we should throw out such a precious piece that's connected to the conquest of the Messiah on the identity of Christ. That's true. I mean, that's, even if it's not in the fathers, that's orthodox right there, saying that Jesus is the Messiah, the son of David, who's going to bring the kingdom. That's as orthodox as you can get, perhaps. I'm kidding, yeah. But no, that's important.
All right, cool.
All right.
I guess Sonna can do, Suan, sorry, you can do your 5-minute close, and Ubi can do his 5-minute close, and maybe we'll do Q&A.
And maybe, okay.
Maybe.
What time is it
Don't
over there
give
for you,
up on
Lewis?
us, Lewis.
It's not that late. It's almost 10, but I haven't had dinner, and
I see. Yeah, that's. Oh, okay. Yeah, and then I'll get my cat once I'm done with my closing statement. Okay, so
go for it.
Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. All right. So once again, let me begin by thanking Ubi Petrus and even Lewis for. Well, let me get. Oh, there we go. And Lewis for inviting me on, and I really appreciate this conversation. I think Ubi did a great job engaging the arguments, and I really appreciate, because sometimes, like when I present my arguments, or I share my paper, someone just says, the papacy is not biblical, and I'm like, did you read the paper? And they say no, or they'll insult me or something like that. So this is a much better change of scenery, so to speak. So today I argued that Christ established a successional Petrine ministry that is supreme and infallible, and I offer 2 standards to help us throughout this debate. So one is whether or not an interpretation is valid or compelling, and the second is the standard of originalism. Now, I think that what we've seen today, we've seen that Ubi can offer a very valid interpretation, and I think that's one of the beauties of the Orthodox theology and ecclesiology, that I think it is in many respects, I think, internally consistent, and can take these similar passages and find what I think are at least sensible counter-interpretations, even if I don't find them compelling. And now to the point on whether or not I've offered a compelling interpretation. So not simply one that's valid, where you can see where I'm coming from, but one that seems to actually make a demand or scream out a particular conclusion. I think when we look at the point of originalism, there are a lot of things that go into understanding what is the original context, because then that gets us closer to what the author or the events or what the people originally meant and understood these things to be. When it comes to authorial intent or the surrounding first century culture or the Jewish theology and traditions, I think that I have a pretty strong basis for my interpretation that Peter is the new Eliakim and that Peter is the new Joshua. And that, for instance, the Peter being the new Eliakim standard can get us papal succession, papal supremacy, papal infallibility, and all that I mentioned before. I think that Ubi has a point, though, about the earliest interpretations, especially among the fathers or even throughout history. But I think I also offered some valuable rebuttals to that. One is that, historically speaking, the fathers are subject to various contingencies. Second, there are examples throughout history in which a source doesn't mention something that we think it ought to have mentioned. And also, independent of whether or not the fathers make this argument, we know that Jesus as the Messiah is the new David, the new Moses, and the new Adam. So we can already use that biblical basis and argument from the first century directly to interpret the text as well, in harmony with and complementing the fathers, but also recognizing that doctrines can develop. I think that's something that we need to go into more detail perhaps next time in another conversation. But to get back to the argument then, or the question on whether or not the papacy is biblical, I argued based on Matthew 16:19 and Isaiah 22:22 that we have 5 solid reasons for affirming the typology between both passages, that they are intertextual. We have 2 reasons for affirming that Peter is the new Eliakim, that is, that both are compared to objects with respect to their ministry. And we also see that both appear first on the list of their king's disciples. Now, even if we kind of highlight the high priesthood of Eliakim, we also acknowledge that Eliakim, Jotham, Ahishar, Azra, and Shebna, in their prime ministerial office, they also could be second in command to the king. So you could have a high priest who's like a high priest like everybody else, but he's set apart because he has the second in command administrative authority as prime minister. So I think that that is a valid way for a Catholic to interpret this passage. And I think it becomes compelling once you make the argument and stress the fact that Jesus really did rebuild the Davidic monarchy and made the church the new Israel, which seems to be attested so clearly in the scriptures. When it comes to Peter being the new Joshua, I also offer 4 reasons for affirming this typology. And then I made the argument that Peter in Acts 5:5 and 11 appears to be able to enact the powers of the throne of Moses on his own without the need of the other apostles. He could use his binding and loosing authority and be immediately and dramatically backed by God. Although I don't know if this can necessarily entail the papacy or be as strong as the other proof, I think it kind of runs counterintuitive to how an Orthodox would expect Peter to be portrayed. Peter could use his binding and loosing power on his own, and God would immediately and directly endorse his power and have it immediately manifested in that way. So then I think that then we have some at least clear arguments for the thesis that I've defended. And we've also seen tonight that Rome plays a huge part in Jewish messianic expectations. And therefore, I think that I, as a Catholic, am not surprised that the prime minister, the new head shepherd of the new Israel, is in Rome.
Nice. I like the timer as well, because it means I don't have to do it.
Yeah.
But for Ubi, I do have to do it. So whenever you're ready, Ubi, go ahead. And I'll give you a 1 minute. I'll give you a 30-second warning. You're muted, by the way, Ubi. You need to unmute.
Okay, there we go. First, I would like to thank Suan for coming on and being an absolutely gracious host earlier today. I encourage all of you to go watch the interview I did at his channel earlier today. And thank you for coming on, being such a gracious guest here. I would like to reiterate that the role of Peter, or the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16, is not so much in terms of a prime ministerial role, but as a high priest. And I would refer the viewers to go see to look at the works of persons like Michael Patrick, what's his name? I can't remember. The three guys I mentioned earlier, the Catholic scholars, Michael Patrick Barber, Brant Petrie, and can't remember the other guy. I'll put his name in the comment section. The connection to Matthew 16 is through the high priesthood, and these scholars argue for that. The high priest in Greek is known as archieros, and it gives the impression of sort of the beginning of the priesthood. Not someone who's exalted above other priests, but the person who's actually the origin of the priest. And that's exactly what the bishop is. The bishop is the only true priest. And this is why in patristic writings, they call bishops oftentimes priests, even in Latin, sacerdotes. I would also like to state that if we cannot find something in the Church Fathers, there's probably a very good reason why we cannot. And the reason is usually it hasn't been invented yet. That's why they don't talk about televisions. And so I'm still very suspect of the connection, even though I can see it myself. I would see the connection far more through the high priestly role that is inherited by each and every bishop. Let's see here. I actually did not prepare a closing statement, as you can tell, so I'm just sort of rehashing some stuff. Okay. So in closing, I would like to point out that St. Ignatius of Antioch, he sets up the system whereby every bishop is the church in and of itself. In other words, every bishop is essentially the temple, just like St. Clement of Rome stated. The high priesthood, the priests, the Levites, the laity, that's every diocese right there. And so St. Ignatius of Antioch, if we triangulate that and we read it with this, he tells the Smyrnaeans in chapter 8 of his letter to them, see that you all follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christ does the Father, and the presbytery as you would the apostles, and reverence the deacons as being the institution of God. Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude of the people also be. Even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. In Greek, it's ekehe katholike ekklesia. It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast, but whatsoever he shall prove of that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. In that phrase, ekehe katholike ekklesia, Catholic there does not mean universal. It means sort of lacking nothing, complete or whole. And that is what St. Ignatius sees each diocese as. It is the complete, the whole, the total church. And so if we look at that and we say, okay, so the bishop is the high priest. Well, each high priest then, or each bishop is a high priest. Each diocese is a temple in itself. Each diocese is the new kingdom of Israel. So each diocese is the new kingdom of Israel. It is the church. And that we are all, in the same way that we're made little Christs and we come together, so each diocese is made a new Israel. And that's all I have to say.
Okay.
Lewis?
Yep. I'm here.
I'm off.
Sorry, everyone. I had you muted because you had some sounds in the background. But
Yeah.
there's the cat.
Oh, he's gorgeous. Look at him.
Oh yeah, he's a handsome cat. Mm-hmm.
How old is he?
He's like I think
How old is he?
3. He's still
he
young,
looks
but
healthy too.
Yeah, always kind of chunky. Okay, I think he wants to get off.
Well, fat cats
no.
are the best cats.
Yeah. Oh, let's see. Oh, now he's gone. Okay, there we go.
All right.
Thank you for showing them to us.
Is that the questions are going to be quite biased to Suan, but let's just take 5 questions. I think let's just
each or just in total.
5 questions in total.
Is fine.
Okay.
Because yeah, and I think I'll do timed responses as well if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Like 1 minute, 1 minute. So then that will give like 10 minutes total. So if you have any questions, just post question and I'll put it on the thing. Next time I need to remember to ask people to do the questions like ahead of time, but
Oh, are there no questions? I thought there would be like tons throughout this whole 3-hour conversation.
well, I mean, there's just generic questions people ask, like rhetorical questions. I mean, I can pick some of those out if you want.
Why does Swan look like Kim Jong-un?
One of them. Someone asked Nabil, says, what does the papacy provide that the Eastern Orthodox lack? And that's to me.
Okay.
Honestly,
Go
I don't.
ahead.
I mean, are we better off without the See of Peter and Paul? Are we really? I mean, are we richer because of it? I don't think it makes us less functional, but are we better off because we don't have it? At the same time, I don't think that's a reason to rush into unity.
Do I get a minute?
Yeah, go ahead if you have something to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, so I appreciate kind of I mean, Ubi doesn't kind of just say, "Oh yeah, you know, like throw out Peter and Paul," or, you know, he doesn't say that. He acknowledges that there is a tragedy that has separated the churches, so to speak. So I appreciate that recognition, that sensitivity. What I would say the papacy offers, I mean, one is that I think that, I mean, there have been some arguments offered by philosophers like Rob Koons and others that it seems at least intuitive that if you have a disagreement among the bishops and the bishops can't agree with one another necessarily, then it would make sense to perhaps have one bishop who could be the master bishop, so to speak, someone who could be the highest seat of authority in himself and unilaterally settle the issues. And of course, I mean, there have been arguments throughout history and even in Israelite philosophy about like why monarchical institutions seem to be superior. And those arguments are still made by individuals like Linda Zagzebski and others, that there's an advantage to monarchical institutions. So I would just add in some of those things into the mix. But also, I think the eschatological picture I painted is important as well.
Mm-hmm. Here's the next question. Ubi, what would it take for you to accept papal primacy, I assume, as defined by Vatican I?
Well, you'd have to show me that it was the constant teaching of the church that this could and did occur. I don't think that Pastor Aeternus can be taken separately from Satis Cognitum. I don't think that someone could simply say, like, well, it's just a seed of it, and, you know, like, I'm not referring to what Suan said. I'm saying I've heard other people say, because then you have Satis Cognitum to deal with, which, even though it's of a lower magisterial order, it still is something that describes what Pastor Aeternus is trying to say.
Do you want to say something about that, Suan?
Yeah, I mean, so because I haven't investigated like at least not even if the entirety, but at least, you know, I haven't investigated all the ecumenical councils, the expanse of what has been written. I'm largely trusting what Ubi and others have said. I mean, it seems as if you have to take the doctrinal development position if you're going to defend Vatican I. So then what I would encourage for someone like Ubi or someone who is in a similar position is, I think you're going to have to ask some fundamental methodological questions on what counts as a valid doctrinal development and whether or not consensus of the fathers is sufficient, but it's not necessary. And my position would be that it seems to be sufficient. It seems to be an important part, but independent of that, there are arguments out there, such as as I mentioned before, the Davidic kingship of Christ, the reconstruction of the monarchy, that even if the fathers don't mention it, they're still ample in there. So I would question the assumption that they would mention everything.
If we have the Sanhedrin view, this is for Ubi, doesn't that mean we can only have one temple?
What does he mean by the Sanhedrin view? The Sanhedrin view of Saint Ignatius of Antioch? I mean, if he's saying that, no, it would mean that every diocese is the temple, every diocese is a new Israel. And then that the presbyters themselves are part of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say that. Oh, sorry. Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think, yeah, Ubi's response is valid,
I think it makes sense. And also, I don't think, I mean, when I read this, I was kind of like, I know how Ubi's going to respond, and the response is internally consistent, so it's a good response. What I would just emphasize, perhaps, is also, I mean, the point that I probably want to emphasize too is that if we're going to accept this background Jewish view on the Jewish court influencing the apostolic structure of the church, then I feel like the typology of Peter being the new Joshua is going to be especially significant, because at least at one time you would have to acknowledge then all the authority of the high court was in one person and could be manifested immediately and directly by him. So that seems to fit better on a Catholic hypothesis than an Orthodox one.
Well, I can't see any more questions. I just see kind of a discussion about the Moscow EP rift, and that's about it. So I don't know. Maybe we could comment on that, and then Suan could comment on that.
There's one here from Cult of Modernism. It says, "How does Suan's position address respond to?" This sounds like it's for you, Suan, even though it tags me. How does your position address or respond to St. Dionysius' teaching in both the ecclesiastical and celestial hierarchies that every divine institution is three-tiered: bishops, priests, and deacons? Ooh, that's a good one. I hadn't thought of that one.
I mean, so it's going to depend first on what exactly we're talking about, right? Because I don't think I'm terribly familiar with the source at hand. So then that's where my knowledge is going to be limited. Could you explain the source a little bit to me, Ubi?
So Dionysius the Areopagite, Pseudo-Dionysius was a writer who wrote under that name. He was a late 5th, early 6th century writer, probably of Syrian origin. And he writes these works called the Celestial Hierarchy and on the Divine Names. They're really good. And in it, he argues that all divine institutions are three-tiered, all of them. There's no fourth tier. In other words, what this person is saying is they're looking at the Pope as if he's a fourth tier. And they're wondering how you reconcile that to the three-tier system of Dionysius.
Yeah, so the argument here would be, so especially when it comes to like how the church views the relationship of the Pope to the Pope to the church at large, the argument here is that the Pope is infallible, not as this kind of like extra, as this extra kind of source alien from the church, but rather the Pope in himself can also speak for the entire church itself. So what we're saying is that, yeah, there is this three-tiered structure system where you have bishop and all the lower hierarchies, right? But I'd say here that what makes the Pope infallible is that he can uniquely share in the infallibility of the church at large. So he has a unique position where he is a bishop among bishops, but then he also has this unique position within the infallibility of the church herself where he can speak. And I would say, you know, once again, too, that we can talk about this three-tier system, but then I bring in the Davidic monarchy once again, which God also says will last forever through David and through one of his sons. I'm not sure if the Davidic monarchy was three-tiered necessarily, so that's another question to ask, but I'd have those two counter responses. One, it's compatible with that interpretation, and second, I think not all divine institutions seem to have that three-tier structure, especially not the Davidic covenant necessarily.
Ubi, do you want a 1-minute response to that? And
no, I think well, because I don't know how it really could be reconciled. I don't see it as reconcilable. And
I don't have to study the source more.
Oh, sorry, there was a delay there. I heard a voice, but I didn't see you talking. Yeah,
I was saying
I'd have to look at the Davidic monarchy and see how it was three-tiered, so I couldn't answer that.
Yeah, but clearly, like, you could still have the prime minister be second in command and have it, let's say, if you happen to find it being three-tiered, so it's still compatible either way.
Well, it also begs the question of what Dionysius means by divine institution.
Yeah.
So, all right, any more questions, or are we going to call it a day? Because good old Lewis looks like he's just had enough caffeine pills.
Let's do this last one. Suan, addressed Pope St. Gregory the Great's Epistle 18 to Bishop John the Faster, in which the Pope plainly says that no single bishop can be raised above other bishops and to usurp.
Is there more to the question, or is it just usurp and then it stops?
It just stops.
I think
Okay.
that's it.
Yeah, I mean, so once again, I should emphasize, I'm going to once again emphasize my ignorance here in this particular area. I don't think I've read this particular text. Although I do know from my friends who have like explored these sources that they don't find these counterexamples convincing when they say like a bishop says one thing and it seems to contradict something else that they say. So I mean, I just have to say, you know, I'm going to have to look and see what Catholic sources have said on this issue, but you know, that's all. And I acknowledge the fact that Ubi is the expert here on the councils and the breadth of history. My studies have focused on the 1st century, the Jewish roots, and the things that are within living memory of the apostles.
If I'm an expert, then we're all in trouble. That's for sure.
No, I think we're in good hands, Ubi. We're in good hands, Ubi, if you're our expert. Yeah.
Oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. Thank God. All right. So so I don't really have a response to that. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear what St. Gregory says. I don't think there's, in my mind, any really way around that, because he warns against there being a sort of super bishop type, and we would see that fulfilled in Vatican I. So that's really more so a question for the Catholic side. I do have a quick question for Suan, if you don't mind. Have we been, when you announced that you were coming on the show, I'm sure you got a flood of people trying to dissuade you from coming on. My question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how mean were we compared to what you were told we would be?
Oh, well, compared. That's interesting. I mean, so how mean are you guys? Like a 0?
Okay.
I didn't feel like you were hostile or anything. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There you go. So, yeah, I mean, anyone is welcome to come on the show. You know, whatever terms they want for a debate. We had a great time today. It was fantastic. It'd be great to have you on again sometime in the future.
Yeah, once I've studied more, yeah.
And oh well, you know, it's been great. So yeah, anyone. I mean, even if Eric Ibarra wanted to come on, he'd be given the same exact treatment, or Michael Lofton, or even Elijah Yassi, or really anyone, even Matt Fradd. I'd even give it to Matt Fradd, which I don't personally have anything against him. I just thought I'd make it sound like I do. Anyway, so well, thank you guys all for watching. Suan, thank you so much for coming on and being such a gracious guest. Lewis, thank you so much for hosting.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Oh, appreciate it. And guys, go check out Suan's channel. We did a great show there earlier today. What's that?
I linked it in the description.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay. Well, I think that calls it a day, and everyone have a great day or night, and talk to y'all later.
All right. See ya.
All right. See